Welcome. Uh, when uh, when Atomic first came out with their announcement for this design, a picture was all we had, and the speculation was rampant very quickly, especially when one of the retailers accidentally posted a set of images that they quickly had to take down because they were supposed to be embargoed for a few days longer. But soon after that, they had a intro trailer. It told us that it was titanium. It told us, oops, oh, we lost it again there, but that's all right. It was just a very short teaser that had nothing but very dark photos and didn't tell us about the center balance design to follow. Indeed, when the fixtures first came out, it became obvious that this was a center balance regulator, and the pedigree that they announced on their slide suddenly made sense. Tonight we'll include a rear exhaust design in the history of center balance designs, just because that's only fair to see the advantages and disadvantages of each of the iterative changes that have been made since the pilot came out. Uh, but I think the first question we have to ask is whether or not it matters, especially at a price point like the TFX. It's a little hard for some of us to justify. I was all in from day one just because that's the way I started with the center balance regulator, and, uh, and so I'm going to hope to bring you over to the dark side and convince you that yet another design is worth considering, because we all want a high performance regulator. And indeed, when you look at the molded case designs, that whether they come from Italy or Taiwan, their performance is all pretty close, at least at the recreational level. And it's only when we put it to the extremes of recreational diving conditions that we start to see differences that you can feel. It's a little bit like a brown bag wine tasting. You may know that that $140 bottle of wine is the best bottle of wine you've ever had, and that somebody puts it in a brown bag and sticks another Bordeaux next to it and asks you to compare the two, and suddenly those subtle differences without the fancy label staring you in the face makes it a little harder to say which one is best, because you can clearly see differences and you'd like to be able to identify your $140 bottle, but 50-50 is you'll guess wrong. But there's other parts that are important to us. We want it to be stable, and that's probably the biggest thing we'll talk about early on tonight is the transition we've made over the years from relatively unstable designs with short service intervals to more stable designs. As a technician, obviously, it'd be nice if it were easier to service and easy to tune, and the D400 earns a lot of disrespect in that regard that we'll come to. But as I say, the stability was perhaps the biggest factor for us. Um, the downstream design that most of us grew up on has a very heavy spring on the poppet. And those of us that have done the reg course together will recognize this slide. A heavy seat wear is very common to downstream designs because they rest in this position. Unless you put a purge button depressor on your regulator during storage, they sit there with 4 to 6 pounds of spring pressure on that seat for months at a time, if you're unlucky enough to not dive more often than that. And they come out looking like this, and the first time you try them after a period of storage, they free flow. Uh, Now, balanced designs obviously have lighter springs, but even they are not immune to seat impression and degradation in performance. And so Atomic sort of took over the market for length of service interval by having a seat saver design, which uses that little circular spring, which is actually shaped in a curve to lift the poppet away from the seat when you're not diving it. Now, of course, that opens the valve, and there's a whole legion of haters out there regarding Atomic's design that says, well, you're going to get water up the hoses. Well, that's true if you don't soak it the way they require with an open valve, but that's a minor issue when you're look at an atomic seat 2 years after you've serviced it, and it hardly has any orifice ring on it at all. But still, why get excited about another expensive second stage? Well, if you could have a reg that's lightweight and durable, and a lot fall into that line, if you could have one with really light spring forces, and that's where center balance regulators really come to the fore, uh, because they do that with their small knife edge. But however they accomplish that, if you have a low cracking effort, that means you're going to have at least low work of breathing on the inhalation side of the ANSTI loop that the manufacturers love to tout in their um, bragging rights ads. If you made it out of metals that were corrosion proof and had good case geometry, which we'll talk about, and is designed with the technician in mind, you know, you have something that may be worth plunking down a little extra money for. But let's play a little history game here first, and let's look and see how we got here. If you are old enough to have dived in the mid-50s, you may have seen something like this in Popular Science, where in fact there was no real recreational diving industry. You had to build your own out of parts that very often were regulators that were used for other purposes. But you could dive as early as that, and if you didn't kill yourself, because we didn't know what we didn't know, it was an exciting time. And it wasn't very long before commercial manufacturers stepped into this gap because there was a need for it amongst the growing diving populace. And my thanks to Luis Harros, who's here in our group tonight, for supplying these pictures of the Spiro technique, because this is one of the earliest regulators that was commercially available, although it's not of a design that we associate with early second stages. So this is more akin to what Poseidon did later, at least with the form factor, and it was very quickly followed by subsequent Spiro technique releases and the Healthways line. And the Healthways line began with the Scubapro, and that's worth looking at just for grins, because the Scubapro had a valve that is positively frightening. If you look inside a Scubapro from the late 50s, see if I can not tear this old diaphragm, you'll see something that is truly frightening. This is an upstream tilt valve, and you're sucking in on the diaphragm, open the tilt valve, and that meant that in the event of a runaway IP, you'd have to depend on a first stage that included an overpressure valve to keep your hoses from bursting, because there was no pop-off mechanism in the second stage itself. This is not a design which has persisted because of safety considerations, and indeed the one we're much more familiar with followed the next year with the Scubapro 300. And the 300 has, as you can see in the top of that inset, a fairly standard lever and spring-loaded poppet that pulls the seat away from the knife edge. Well, unfortunately, Healthways went bankrupt in '62, and so that was a short-lived foray, although Spiro Technique continued to market their own regulators well into the 70s and 80s. But the one that followed was Scubapro. Dick Bonin and Gustave Della Valle purchased the right to the Scubapro name from Healthways when it went bankrupt for all of $1. And their first introduction of the 108 in 1963 set the standard for downstream second stages. It is a classic which is still dived today, and like all downstream second stages, is Franz with his finger in the dike. It's a spring-loaded poppet that holds back the force of intermediate pressure against the knife edge, and as long as the spring holds out, as long as Hans' strength holds out, you'll have control of your valve. But it's still susceptible to the seat wear that all downstream second stages are at risk for. And Mares has even finally come over the dark side in that regard, because they have had downstream second stages on even their highest end regulators up until almost a decade ago, and only now are starting to market balanced second stages. And they could get away with it because their first stages were so well balanced that from full to empty tank, they'd have very little change in IP, and therefore a second stage design like this, which is very sensitive to changes in intermediate pressure, would remain breathable throughout the tank fill. But the design that we're all familiar with, the barrel design second stage, whether it's the G250 or the G260 or any of Aqualung's introductions, or of course the Atomics, are all a barrel design, a balanced second stage, where a much lighter spring keeps the poppet closed, but isn't enough to keep the poppet against the knife edge against intermediate pressure. And it requires the assistance of a little pneumatic spring, which builds up pressure behind the shaft of the poppet through that hole down the middle and keeps the valve closed. And it's balanced because as tank pressure falls and the force of intermediate pressure trying to push that valve open is counterbalanced by a pneumatic spring, which also weakens with the drop in tank pressure. And so the valve retains its opening force throughout the tank fill much better than a downstream second stage. Now, Peter McMahon is one of several authors who has publications out there. You can find them on Scuba Board, like the Scubapro Timeline or the History of Scubapro Regulators, and you'll see statements like this made, where the balanced adjustable was the first second stage to offer a balanced design, and it was introduced in 1985. Well, that is not correct, and it's not the first urban myth out there, because the balanced second stage is antedated the balanced adjustable by a significant bit. If we go to a guy named Tony Christensen, 3 years before the balanced adjustable, he had this short-lived design, which he patented a couple of years later, called the Zephyr. And the Zephyr was an extraordinarily complex mechanism, and unfortunately it didn't last on the market but less than a year, just due to market forces. But in fact, it was balanced. Spirotechnique was still at it as well. If you look, and again, my thanks to Luis Harros for providing me these pictures. If you look at their Elise S from 1974, it was the first design to incorporate a pilot valve. It may or may not have been center balance. I can't quite tell from the schematic, but it incorporated a new feature where, instead of having that heavy spring overcome by the mechanical advantage of a large lever and a lot of cracking effort, it used a servo valve that used intermediate pressure to help push the poppet open, actuated by the diver with a much lighter force. And although this regulator as well only lasted about 4 years, is noteworthy for our discussion tonight, just because on the right, that's a picture of Luke Skywalker. And during the filming of Star Wars, when he was submerged during his rebirth scene, he is in fact breathing off an Elise S, which you can see in his right hand. So that's their claim to fame, even if it's not a design which has lasted. The one that has lasted, of course, is the Scubapro Pilot. The Scubapro Pilot is the standard by which all other regulators are judged, and we'll see why very shortly. It's certainly an elegant design, hand brazed chromed brass, somewhat heavy, but counterbalanced by a modest amount of air within the chamber to lighten it in your mouth. It's nonetheless a fairly heavy regulator, but it is in fact the lightest breathing regulator ever invented, because it combines both the pilot mechanism, the servo mechanism that may have been seen before in the Elise S from Spirotechnique, with a center balance valve. And unfortunately, urban myth jumps into the fray again. If you look at At this slide, you'll see another of Peter McMahon's statements that that the pilot was designed by an MIT student as a class project, and that urban myth went on and on for a long time until finally the inventor had enough and made a post in 2019 on the Vintage Scuba forum, uh, claiming correctly, of course, that in fact he was the one that invented the Scubapro Pilot. Tony Christensen invented the Pilot several years before he invented that Zephyr, and the Pilot was so good that it was used at depths that were absolutely unheard of. In 1979, the Naval Experimental Dive Unit used a Scubapro Pilot for their safety diver, and took a team testing a low resistance breathing system, because of course at 1,800 feet you have unbelievable gas density, counterbalanced to a certain extent by helium, but a single hose diver would have not been able to dive air with any survivability, even not considering nitrogen narcosis. But being able to dive even helium-containing mixtures to that depth stood for many, many years, and that's in 1979. And that safety diver, in fact, used a Scubapro Pilot. So Tony Christensen has a magical device here. Now, this is a complex mechanism. There is just no two ways about it. With 112 callouts on the patent diagram, this was a monster. But the thing that's worth noting is that this design is center balanced. If air comes in the hose connection at the top left of your slide, it very quickly splits. Half goes left, half goes right, and runs into two O-ring seals. The one on the right is the bottom of the poppet, which is in a bore of almost exactly the same diameter as the knife edge on the left. And the top and the left O-rings are sitting in that movable seat, and the two forces almost completely balance each other because the diameters are almost identical, and it takes only a very light spring to hold that poppet in place and keep it sealed. It uses simple hydraulics to maintain the poppet in a neutral mechanism, only slightly loaded in favor of the left-hand pair of O-rings, or the left-hand O-ring. It's a single O-ring, of course, and therefore requires only a light spring to keep it in place. The difficulty is that it's an unbelievably complicated valve, and if we look at this valve, let's see right here, we can see a poppet which is quite hefty. There's a lot of weight to this, but it does cover a huge, an absolutely huge knife edge orifice. So the gas flow from this is just monstrous, but it requires something other than physical force to open this valve, to move this poppet. And this little diddly lever is not enough to do it. The knife edge was very quickly an area of concern to technicians, because you can see in the top just how delicate it is, and damage to it became an early phenomenon that we'll return to. But there were other features that made this design absolutely magical. It's truly unparalleled. And the next was that it incorporated dynamic diaphragm geometry. As you started your breath, the effective diameter of the diaphragm was with the green arrows, but as you sucked it in, it folded itself against a metal tray, and the effective diameter dropped significantly. That was important because this regulator had such huge flow that it generated such venturi force that keeping a full-size diaphragm there would have made it much more difficult to terminate the flow. In addition, in yellow, you'll see that rotatable collar, which also throttled gas to the mouthpiece, again, to control the tremendous venturi forces that were active. And the valve mechanism we'll look at here just with a little back and forth. If you look at this, the lever is very tiny movement. And because of the small mechanical advantage of that lever, lifting that heavy metal poppet is a not insignificant requirement. And so what this regulator does, in fact, is uses hydraulic forces to open the valve. This is activated by a servo pilot mechanism, which is carried with this little tiny green post. The lever pushes against this ball bearing and pushes this little tiny post to the right a fraction of an inch. And when it does that, it lifts this purple seat, which is only about 2.5 millimeters across, with the tiniest O-ring you've ever seen. It's not even a number 1, and lifts it away from a secondary knife edge inside the poppet. There's not one knife edge here where the seat is, but a secondary one inside. And so as this seat is lifted away, this allows intermediate pressure to sneak by it and gather behind the poppet to use intermediate pressure to force the poppet to the right and open the valve, despite the puny mechanical advantage provided by the lever. Just a magnificent mechanism. As with anything this complex, there's always a fly in the ointment. And in the pilot's case, as you'll find out if you try and service one, we have a dissimilar metals problem. This little disc at the bottom has a very carefully calibrated hole cut in it that just accepts the diameter of this little servo piston. And the servo piston is steel, the little collar is aluminum, and dissimilar metals work their magic. And of course, there's no slippery seal between this point and this smooth shaft. And so if you have a pilot that you're trying to service that will not respond to efforts to lower cracking effort, you'll discover late in the game, as I did, that it's friction here and polishing this little half-inch long sleeve is what's required to get you back in shape. So taking this valve apart is just either a frustration or a joy because there's so many pieces inside. Here's that little sleeve, and the top of the poppet holds this secondary mechanism inside with an even lighter spring that carries the servo piston. And if I can get it to come out, I may not be able to. Oh, there it is. That little tiny O-ring and seat mechanism that opens the servo and allows it to get enough force behind it to move that poppet off the knife edge. Very sophisticated and maddening for the technician, but it was unsurpassed. Well, with anything this complicated, the search immediately began for something less expensive to manufacture, if nothing else. And that was in fact the case where Scubapro immediately started work on a parallel mechanism, which most of you will recognize as the Air1. The Air1 was a plastic-bodied version of the Pilot, but it contained a different valve mechanism in it. What they did was replace the 13 parts of Tony Christensen's poppet, servo-controlled, with a simple one-piece plastic deal that was fused together at the factory. I mean, it actually consisted of 4 parts, but they were bonded together as the top of this plastic shaft was melted to the top of the cap and supplied as a single unit. That one moving part and one O-ring replaced these 13 parts. And because of the tremendous savings of weight, you could get by with just a slightly longer lever to drive it. And now that you could use a little bit longer lever, you got around the fact that this poppet, as elegant as it was also heavy. So that the total parts count for the Air1 was significantly less. But what that did was that it did allow the Pilot to continue its lifetime for a little longer. You can recognize the original pilot on the left and compare it with the Air1 valve pilot on the right with this little button in it and a conical top. And what that was hiding was that very simple mechanism inside. And this made it much easier for technicians to service. It matched performance by about 75%, but you still couldn't get this to crack at a half an inch like you could the original pilot. In any case, the balanced adjustable appeared and it left the other regulators in the dust. And the balanced adjustable is end balanced. It doesn't have the same efficiency as the center balance mechanism. But economics, ease of service, just sheer popularity because of the finicky nature of the pilot just allowed the balance adjustable to take over, and its G250 that followed, and the G260 that came after that, all left the pilot in the dust. So these are the regulators that we grew up with. Whether it's an Aqualung version, a US Divers version before that, any of the manufacturers both shot, they all follow the balance adjustable or the plastic G250 match of that uses a center balance mechanism. I'm sorry, an end balance mechanism. You'll all perhaps recognize this if you've taken the cover off of your second stage. And what you have is a lever which drives a poppet, flexing it away from the orifice, the knife edge right here, that opens the valve and feeds your gas. This is a lovely design, a lovely model given to me by Robert Cuvilon, and it was a wonderful gift of his before he passed away, and I use it in all the classes. This is the standard mechanism, whether it's Atomic, Beauchat, Aqualung, Mars, any of the balance designs are using a variation on this mechanism. What's different about center balancing? Well, the big deal about center balancing, not to be silly about it, is that it's center balanced. The IP that comes in and pushes in one direction is almost exactly balanced by the air pressure pushing in the opposite direction. And when you have a design that has about 1/10 of a millimeter difference in diameter, we're talking about a 1/2 pound difference in forces to keep your valve closed. And that's a significant amount when you start looking at the numbers, which I won't do much of tonight. Compare that, however, with our end balanced standard. This is something that we're very used to seeing. But if you look at the numbers, you look at the sizes, we have a tremendous difference between the poppet shaft of an end balanced second stage and the orifice. Not to mention the orifice size itself, which was perhaps 8 millimeters across for the pilot and only 5.5 for a G250. But when you compare these, in addition to the spring forces required to supplement that smaller poppet shaft, that poppet shaft is not helping keep the valve closed like it does in a center balance design, so you need a heavier spring. But not only that, you have a potential effect on dynamic action of the valve. Think about this for a moment. You've got IP pushing that orange poppet to the left. It's trying to push the valve open. Indeed, if your IP gets too high because of a first stage malfunction, it will push the poppet open. It'll push that toilet seat right off the valve and it'll leak because there is a deliberate disparity between the orifice size and the poppet shaft size. That preserves a little imbalance so that as IP rises, accidentally due to a malfunction, it will eventually overcome the ability of the valve to stay closed and provide you a safety pop-off. But it's much less closely balanced than a center balance valve. And that means that if you're at the end of your dive and you weren't watching your SPG and you're at 60 or 70 feet and you look down and you've got 400 PSI left in your tank, and you have an oh my goodness moment and say, okay, it's time to get to the surface, and will I or will I not skip my safety stop? As you're sucking on your reg in your half panic, the dynamic drop in what your first stage is supplying to you is significant. It only has 300 PSI of driving pressure from the tank working through the first stage mechanism. And in the middle of a breath, at the peak flow of a breath, you may suck your IP from 130 down to 80 or 70. You may have wild swings in your IP. Well, think about how your end balance valve responds to that. You've got a strong IP trying to open the valve. You have that strong IP gathered in the blue pocket of the balance chamber, helping keep it closed. But suddenly you take a breath and you open the valve and you only have 60 PSI of dynamic intermediate pressure because your first stage can't keep up. Well, for the balance chamber to work, you've got to have out migration of gas out of that little tiny pocket down the center bore of that poppet. And that takes time. That takes a fraction of a second to occur. So you have 130 PSI in your balance chamber, and as soon as the breath starts, you suddenly only have 60 PSI on the other side, and it's much harder to open that valve. Now, I haven't measured it, so that's a theoretical speculation on my part, but the point is that the valve on the top right, the center balance valve, doesn't have that problem. And we'll show you tonight. Before we move on, let's take one more look at the magic of the poppet of the pilot. The pilot has this diaphragm which sits inside the case, and it's just laying here. It's free floating. Now, in fact, it is trapped at the bottom by this little plate, but that tethers only the bottom edge, and the entire top of the mechanism is free floating. And so if you peel that back, you can see the sealing surface of the brazed chamber, and the mechanism would sit behind this. But this diaphragm is just free floating in the chamber, and that means when you exhale, the entire top of the diaphragm opens up to become an exhalation passage. And indeed, the openings on the bottom of the regulator are substantial. So that this reg was just a wonder not only on inhalation, but on exhalation. This valve would just open up so well because it was only tethered at the bottom. Now, it wasn't the only one to do that. In fact, the Poseidon regulator has a similar design. Its diaphragm is free floating on the top of the jet stream telephone handle, and it floats up and out of the way and has tremendous exhalation forces, ease of exhalation. But this regulator antedated it by decades. Well, not everything was hunky-dory with that design. Because it was tethered at the bottom, it was very easy to seal against hydrostatic pressure. And remember, you've got those open holes in the case here, allowing ambient water to press against this diaphragm and keep it sealed. But the top side was only held in place by its natural elasticity, or when you tended to look up, by water that accumulated in the chamber here. But if you went inverted, it was much more likely to breathe wet. And the problem with that is that when you're with a regulator that has a low diaphragm and a high mouthpiece, when you go inverted and it then breathes wet, that's a straight shot to your mouth, and so it's its wet breathing was quite uncomfortable. Now, it wasn't the only regulator to start to incorporate this center balance design. Before we move on to what you all came here for, I think it's worth mentioning that there were others. The Germans, who very quickly were joined by Scubapro, because this is in fact a UATEC regulator, but this was designed by Draeger, and it too had a center balance mechanism. And I have to credit George Sunis, who's I think was here tonight. Yeah, he's here, for helping find these regs for us, because these are just magical designs to look at. And the cool thing about them is that, oh, let's see, wrong run. Let's try this one. Is that there is a coaxial diaphragm and exhaust valve. And if you look at the exhaust valve here, it's right in the center of the diaphragm, and use a different mechanism. This is a completely captured diaphragm with this exhaust valve sitting on top, and a center balance valve that is magnificent because it has no knife edge. When you open this, pop it up, you see a cone that nestles into this seat, and instead the seal is maintained by this little tiny O-ring that mates against the seat of that cone. And so this is a very long-lived design in terms of time between services, but like many things German, is very intricate, akin to the Pilot, and its accompanying first stage is a real monster to service. But it's worth mentioning that Scubapro wasn't the first, although they very quickly glammed onto the advantages of this design. If you take all of these designs, take a sharp knife edge, which the German design abandoned, take light spring forces, and take this coaxial valve, you have the birth of the regulator that then followed for the next couple of decades. That coaxial valve, again, was not unlike the Poseidon, but it had a very interesting contribution with regard to case geometry that we'll return to. In any case, the D series, which was Scubapro's next introduction, made it just within reach of everyone, and this was the design that occupied me for the entire first half of my diving career, and it has some interesting similarities. Here's the housing for the Pilot, and here's the housing for the Air1. You can see immediately the change that was made in the orifice knife edge diameter. So your flows immediately took a hit, but that was about the only sacrifice that was made. That orifice persisted in the D series then for the next 15 of those 20 years with a very lightweight poppet that was easy to move compared with the monster that sat inside the Pilot. As is suggested, what they then made use of was that German idea of having a coaxial valve. And the D400 had its diaphragm right here, and then its exhaust valve right on top of it. So that as you inhaled, the diaphragm went in. As you exhaled, air just came right out the center and out the sides of this famous case, which was so frustrating to remove. It's amazing that these cases have stood up as long as they have. This is one that just came in for service last week from a buddy of mine in Hawaii. This is one of the few that I've torn some 35 years after it was introduced. That it's amazing that this rubber has lasted as long as it has, but you can see how cracked and dry this one is, and we had to give them a replacement case. But the mechanism was magical, because now instead of an end balance mechanism that was fed from one end, let's have the hose on the same side, it's now fed right into the middle. And the part that goes up causes the poppet to rise, and the part that goes down is held in check by this bottom of the poppet, and the two are almost identical, so that the lever forces required to open this valve are just magically small. There's one more thing that's worth looking at here, and that's the flow path from the valve to the mouthpiece. It is direct, and we'll come back to that. But whatever happened, the D series made it possible, and it went, as I say, for nearly 20 years. If I move myself up out of the way, we'll see that it lasted from 86 to 2002. Now, apart from center balancing, what does a design like the D series bring to the table? Well, we just touched on part of it. The flow to the diver is short. It is so short that, in fact, Stuart V, who has commented in our thread, thinks he notices a little dry mouth because he's unused to that rush of completely dry tank air coming right at him. And we'll see over time whether that's an issue. It's not something that I can say I've noticed with the D400, because I've dived this for 20 years. But again, it too has a very short flow pathway from the valve to the mouthpiece. That's something worth keeping in mind. But if you compare that with the end balanced mechanism, you can see the convoluted pathway that gas has to follow, coming from the orifice down along and around the poppet, and then through the spring to come out the hole, then to come out the mouthpiece. It's 5 times as long. So that's one of the biggest things that sets the center balance design apart, but it's not the only thing that D series brought to the table. This is our excuse to now delve into case geometry, because that'll come back to us with regard to the TFX. If you look at your standard end balance design, and you're lying face down in the water, looking straight down at the bottom, not a condition that you typically swim along in, but one that you regularly do as you look at something on the sea floor, you'll see something that Pete Wolfinger identified in his book Regulator Savvy. This is really our Bible, and he laid it out for all of us to have at our fingertips with just wonderful diagrams. So this diagram is borrowed from Mr. Wolfinger, and it shows the worst case scenario for case geometry for a standard end balanced regulator. There is 1.25 inches from the deepest part of the diaphragm in the water and the top of the exhaust valve. Now let's think what that means. If you've got air at ambient pressure in this regulator, the ambient pressure in this is an average of this depth in the water column and this depth in the water column. It's got some average ambient pressure. In fact, if the pressure is any higher than this level in the water, the reg will bubble out, won't it? Because this point in the regulator is shallower than this point. So if the air pressure inside this is higher than this level in the water, the reg will have little bubbles coming out. Okay, so this reg bubbles out until the ambient pressure in this hard plastic case is at this level in the sea. That means that this part of the diaphragm is deeper in the water by 1.25 inches. What does that mean to a flexible skirt? It means that that diaphragm wants to bow in. You've got 1.25 inches of water pressure pushing on that. And if you take a saucer, a 3-inch saucer, and push it into the sink, 1.25 inches, you'll feel some force pushing back at you, won't you? So that's what's pushing against the flexible skirt of this diaphragm. It's also pushing against the lever that's touching the back of this diaphragm. And if your valve isn't set to a cracking effort of at least 1.25 inches, your valve will free flow because seawater wants to push up on this diaphragm so that it can match this level in the case, this level of ambient pressure in the seawater, because this is where the leak is occurring. And this is why most standard ballast designs need about 1.1 inches of valve tension to stay closed. Because if you have significantly less than that, when you look straight down in the water, you'll notice it. You'll hear a little subtle bubbling, or you'll feel something coming out of the exhaust tee. You'll feel your valve free flowing just slightly. And if you like to hot tune your regs and run them down to 0.8, you'll definitely notice it. It's very subtle. Divers who like hot tune regs put up with that because they don't maintain this position for very long. And in fact, when you're swimming in the water in the normal position, the center of the diaphragm is just about equal with this edge. If you picture turning this valve so that these 2 points line up, that's just about looking 15 to 20 degrees down like you're swimming along in the water. And that's a 0 case geometry fault in that one position. But as soon as you look down, it jumps to 1.25 inches. Well, let's compare that with the D400 that was introduced. The D400 has no case geometry fault in this position. There's the diaphragm, there's the exhaust valve, they're at the same place in the water, and this regulator pressurizes to this depth in the water. Indeed, if you take your mouth off of this regulator or the end balanced design, it'll free flow. We all know that. If you take it out of your mouth with the mouthpiece up, it'll free flow. Why? Because this point in the water is lower than the mouthpiece. Therefore, you've got 2 inches of difference pushing on that valve, and the valve is open. So that when your mouth is on it, when your mouth lung body complex is attached to this regulator, there in fact is 2 inches of difference pushing on this. This valve wants to be open, but at least it's enough spring pressure in this mechanism or in the one before it so that the valve doesn't open. And all that you've got inside the case is about 2 inches of air pressure minus the cracking effort of 1 inch. So you've got about 1 inch of positive pressure, which we don't even notice when we dive. That reg is always trying to help us breathe. And that's one reason why most regulators seem to perform so well, because in the standard diving position, whether it's this design or this design tilted at the right angle, it requires very little effort to open the valve because the valve is already halfway open just because the diaphragm is slightly lower in the water. Well, that all changes with an end balanced design. When you look up in the water with a D400, your case geometry fault is a little over 1/2 inch because that's the difference in height between the center of the diaphragm and the top of the exhaust valve. That means you can run this valve as light as 0.6. And indeed, that's where I dive my D400. It's effortless to breathe, and you can get away with that because this is the worst case for a center balance design with a coaxial diaphragm. Well, there's all this magic attached to the D series, and I bought into it. I drank the Kool-Aid for 20 years. I love how lightly it breathes. But the fact is that you couldn't get this cover off to save your life. You had technicians who were regularly dinging the knife edge. This very, very delicate metal knife edge was enough of a problem that Scubapro actually came along in their last model of the D400 and they changed to that ubiquitous plastic valve that we all know from our G250s. They went away from the metal orifices and went to a plastic orifice, and the plastic orifice was identical. It's very durable. It sheds ice well, but sharp it ain't. And you can't get as low a cracking effort with this plastic orifice as you could with these metal ones, certainly not with the D400 tuned to 0.6 inches. But it was worse than that because we had the problem then of technician training. You know, technicians who were trained by Scubapro learned off of a multi-page document like this, and you had to be tested on that before you walked out of your course with Scubapro certification. So technician training was an issue. You combine all these factors, whether it's the difficulty of getting the cover off, and that's in fact how I got into regulator service when the shop perforated the diaphragm on my own D400 the first time I brought it in, and told me that it had a hole in it, and I thought the heck it did. It was breathing just fine before I gave it to you guys. So they had to, do silly stuff like using a spoon to get the cover off. Whether it was that or the nicks that the technician put in the knife edge because he used metal tools to lift the poppet out, or the fact that the technical education program changed from this long workbook with quizzes and a written test to a 4-hour lecture at DEMA at which everybody passed, everybody graduated, and everybody walked out with the entitlement to service your regulators, even though they knew nothing about it. Technician training has really fallen. But there was one last little piece of this that was an aggravation, and that's exhalation work of breathing. One thing we didn't really look at, we didn't really appreciate until the last decade, is the effect of exhalation work of breathing on our total work of breathing. And we'll come back to this because it's significant, and that's what Regulator Geeks 3 was all about, the testing of all these regulators at 120 feet on nitrox. So that was a gas density of almost 6 grams per deciliter, and what it's like trying to move thick air through these valves. And that was a whole 3-hour discussion on its own. But the combination of this little factor, which really wasn't appreciated until 10 years ago, plus the difficulty of service, the delicacy of the knife edge, Scubapro just gave up, and they abandoned it for 17 years. As you guys may remember, in 2019, the Scubapro D420 was quietly introduced, and this wonderful regulator certainly excited me because it seemed to answer all the concerns we had. It had the short throw, the short flow path that the D400 had. It had the original knife edge, only now it was in plastic. And if you were willing to plunk down the $50 for a service kit, you got an entire new knife edge with every service kit. And if you were careful, that meant you had spares in between services. If you didn't let the technician do the service and you kept this pristine and kept it in the bag. And interestingly enough, they had these little odd fins inside the case. And those fins were dedicated to exhalation work of breathing. If you take apart a D400, you'll see these little fins in here and this massive exhaust valve. And you suddenly realize, wait a second, the coaxial exhaust valve of the D400 is gone. They've moved the exhaust valve around to its standard position in the back of the regulator, just like everybody else. And what that meant is that when you then looked at the Anstey loops that everybody has bragging rights about, the anti-loops showed that huge exhaust valve that in the standard diving position now was highest in the water. Well, with a high exhaust valve and a low diaphragm, the diaphragm would preload things. Because the diaphragm was preloaded, it was easy to inhale. And because of that high, large exhaust valve, it was easy to exhale. And in fact, the D420 does have the easiest exhalation work of breathing of any regulator on the market today. It was easy to take apart. I mean, you put a pin wrench through the hole and the purge lever comes off. The diaphragm turns out to be interchangeable with the Air2. The lever comes apart very easily. This all lifts out, and you get a new knife edge with every service kit. So it was pretty cool. At least it seemed that way for those of us that were excited about the center balance design. Case geometry, though, reared its ugly head. Here's our end balance design on the left with 1.25 inches of separation between the diaphragm and the exhaust valve. That's down to 1/2 inch when you're in the standard diving position, and that makes it tolerable for guys that like to hot tune their regulators. But take that same position in the water, we still have 1.2 inches between the top of the exhaust valve and the diaphragm in the D420, and that's almost the standard diving position. And what that meant was that this regulator needed a cracking effort of 1.2 or 1.1 to be dived. You couldn't dive this at 0.6. It would free flow. Why? Because ambient sea pressure would preload the lever, it would open the valve, and because the top of the exhaust valve was so shallow, so much shallower in the water, more than 0.6 inches shallower, the reg would just bubble away. So you had to have 1.1 inches. The reason 1.1 is okay when you have a 1.2 inch difference is a thing called stiction. Surface tension in the water gives you a little added benefit. You can cheat a little bit on the physical distance because surface tension and other dynamic forces prevent the exhaust valve from opening. But for all intents and purposes, the point was you needed a big cracking effort. And what that meant was when you then looked up at a shrimp under a ledge with this regulator that breathed so easily, that had wonderful anti-loops, because that's what generated this, really. They were saying, how can we get bragging rights for this regulator? They're thinking about the standard diving position, and in the standard diving position, the D420 is magnificent. It's just magnificent. And you get a free knife edge with the service kit. But when you look up under a ledge, you have your 1.2 inches or 1.1 inches of cracking effort, and you have another inch of difference between the poppet and the mouthpiece. And that's what's coupled to your mouth, throat, lung complex that you breathe off of. And now instead of a positive 1 inch that you're not even noticing, now you have to suck 2 inches plus to open this valve, doing something as simple as looking up underneath a ledge. This reg is kind of a pig in that regard. Well, why'd you all come here? You all came here for the Atomic TFX, and let's look at their intro. This is a
For over 25 years, Atomic Aquatics has been reimagining, re-engineering, and redesigning scuba gear, creating the most advanced, highest performing, and highly coveted equipment in the dive industry. Okay, then I'll shut up. The newest addition to our premier collection of gear is the Atomic Aquatics TFX Regulator. Titanium front exhaust. Why do you need a rather unconventional front exhaust regulator design? It's all about attitude. Traditional rear exhaust regulators have more breathing resistance in certain dive positions, like looking up. The TFX is the ultimate connoisseur's breathing regulator, with natural, effortless, and sophisticated air delivery in all diving attitudes. The main benefit of the TFX is the enhanced breathing performance and reduced inhalation cracking effort. requiring about half the cracking effort compared to all other regulators on the market. Once again, Atomic engineers deconstructed every component of previous front exhaust regulator designs to reevaluate and reimagine. Fabricated from elite materials, the TFX is a fresh, high-performance design with superior dryness in all conditions. The genesis of the unique Atomic TFX design lies in positioning the exhaust valve in the center of the inhalation diaphragm and mounting both in the front of the regulator, which provides enhanced performance benefits not possible in a conventional design. Exclusive signature Atomic Aquatics design elements include all titanium second stage metal components for complete corrosion resistance and strength. Variable lift cam increases lift at high demands, easily controlled with a near frictionless action lever to provide high flow with low inhalation effort. Seat-saving dynamic orifice automatically retracts away from the seat when not under air pressure to extend service life and maintain like-new breathing performance. Extended silicone exhaust tee is uniquely designed with a sweeping flexible front purge cover and soft rubber exhaust deflectors that route the exhaust away from and behind the diver's field of view. New first stage 4X yoke connection secures to the tank 4 times faster with just one turn. The TFX regulator is a bold, radical new front exhaust design featuring a complex series of fluid and natural geometries that integrate seamlessly with the case and front cover. Like other Atomic Aquatics titanium regulators, the TFX delivers divers assurance with a 3-year 300 dive service interval and limited lifetime warranty. Atomic Aquatics TFX regulator. It's all about attitude.
Well, there it is. And indeed, if you look at the valve mechanism, which we'll do very shortly, because I've only got one of these, the similarity with the D400 is hard to ignore. And that shouldn't be a surprise to you because, in fact, Doug Toth, that I believe designed this regulator, left Scubapro with more than one Scubapro engineer to form Atomic. And whatever differences of opinion they had have allowed them to carve out a niche in terms of designing regulators that are very close to what Scubapro designed because they were on the engineering team. And now I think, since the patent must have expired, they are free to return to what Mr. Toth designed 20 years ago with some improvements. Let's look at that in some detail, and then we'll take this baby apart. The valve that we'll see shortly is very much like the D400 valve with some significant improvements. It is center balance, duh, that's why we're here. And it has this cam-shaped lever that we'll look at up close and personal. But let's see how that works. When you have a lever, the top of the lever, in fact, is hemispherical. If I look at the D400 lever here in front of me that I just pulled out of the valve, you can see that the lever has a flat side and a rounded side. And that means that whenever this pivots, the flat side lifts off of the hex screw, the set screw underneath, and that pivoting action very smoothly lifts the poppet that's resting on top of it. Well, in the case of the TFX, in addition to a hemispherical lever right here, they added a little cam. And now, instead of having a simple rise of X based on the base lift of the poppet, you have not only that lift, but you have the additional bulge provided by the cam to virtually double valve opening. So you're going to take a regulator with a short flow path from the poppet to the mouthpiece and couple it with markedly increased valve opening. So this is a schematic that you will get tired of watching before tonight's over, but it's worth getting used to what you'll be seeing as we talk about what's magic about this valve. It's got a housing which on the left looks very much like the D400. Indeed, the D400 valve in its last iteration also had a removable knife edge. Now, as a Delrin, dull knife edge component, this was a poor substitute for what's in the TFX, but the two already share that technology. The sizes of A and B on the balanced side of the poppet are, again, are very close to each other. And so as a result, balancing forces are very light, and it takes a very light spring to close this valve. One thing to keep in mind is that when IP enters this chamber, it's pushing on the left and pushing on the right. And so to the extent that the right side, the brown knife edge, is slightly larger than the gray base of the seat, plus the O-ring, there is a slight displacement force to the right. This seat wants to pop off, doesn't it? And it too, like a downstream, except with a much slighter spring, requires a little spring to stay on top. But the difference in forces is so much less than an end balance valve. This is your only death by PowerPoint coming up for the evening. It'll take about 2 minutes. Here are some of the numbers. If you have a half a pound difference because of those differences in diameters, as we see on the top, that gives us a net opening force of half a pound. We're now going to put a little light spring on top of it, a 1.5 pound spring, and that's roughly what we've got in this regulator, at least based on my postal scale measurements. You should compare that with an end balance regulator, which is about a 2 to 2.5 pound spring. So already forces against the seat, the forces of this knife edge digging into the seat, are 40% less than they are in your G260 Aqualung Atomic. So you have a net 1 pound force pushing down on the seat, and let's add to it the fact that the lever in the TFX is much longer than the lever in the D400. This is about a 10 to 1 lever in my hand and about a 15 to 1 lever inside the TFX. So what that means is that this regulator has a 50% advantage, mechanical advantage, as the top of the lever rotates, and it's got a cam to increase its throw. So to open this valve, you need more than 1 pound of counterforce to open it. Well, more than 1 pound of counterforce to open it with a 15 to 1 mechanical advantage is about 0.07 pounds. And 0.07 pounds with a modest sized diaphragm is 2/100ths of a psi. And to put that into terms that make sense to us, 2/100ths of a psi is 0.7 inches water column. If you want an even lighter seal than that, all you have to do is unscrew the spring in yellow on top until it finally breaks loose. Now, what were we wrestling with the D400 that I loved so much? The cover was a pain in the ass. The sharp knife edge was delicate. And you have this exhalation work of breathing thing that we proved on the Spiegel Grove with Reg Geeks 3, that this was not as much fun. As much as I loved that regulator and wanted it to do the best, it was not my favorite when I was working hard at depth at 120 feet on nitrox. No helium, so I had high gas density, and that's something that an adventurous recreational diver would confront. You're in current, you're at the Spiegel Grove like 1,000 other divers a year. You're on a high current day and you've not been paying attention. You kind of drifted downstream a bit, and now you realize that, oh, up there, I've got to get to my anchor line because that's where the ball is to take me to the surface. And now you're kicking at 120 feet to get upstream to be able to ascend. You're using gas at a prodigious rate. And if your exhalation work of breathing is high, It's the sort of thing that leads to CO2 retention, that leads to panic, and poses a real risk for somebody who's stepping beyond the 60-foot recreational dive and is doing what so many thousands of other divers do a wreck dive that lots of other people do. And if Rainbow Reef can take a cattle boat with 40 divers on it out to there, then it must be okay, right? Well, you can find yourself in conditions where a regulator with a high exhalation work of breathing will scare you. Well, if we add to that the last piece of the puzzle, the technician training and the damage that was caused to this regulator, you can see why Scubapro kind of gave up until the D420. And with the D420, they fixed the ease of service, they fixed the replaceable knife edge, they fixed the exhalation work of breathing, but they didn't fix the fact that you could only use this reg in one position. That as soon as you went vertical in the water, as soon as you looked up a little bit, things really were poor. Instead, you came to look at the TFX tonight. And when you look at the difference in the TFX and the D420, the differences just jump out at you. You've got a coaxial diaphragm and exhaust valve again. You've got zero case geometry fault then in just about any position, maybe as much as 0.6 if you look at the times when the diaphragm is vertical in the water and the exhalation valve is just a little bit higher in the water column. But with zero case geometry and 1 inch of distance from the center of the diaphragm to your mouth, we've got a 1 inch suck requirement looking straight up, maybe 1.5 inches if you add this case geometry fault. Compare that with 2.5 inches in the D400, and it's night and day. And in fact, Scubapro has decided to cancel their marketing of the D420. It wasn't selling really well. I don't know how well technicians embraced a center balance model because it's not difficult to service, but it is different. And so you have to learn that again, and nobody's training them on this. So instead, we've got our toy, and let's have a little fun with it. The tools that are required are pretty. Let's try again. Let's try this one. The tools that are required are pretty modest. And James 79 is already agreeing to 3D print those two red items, a little adjuster here with his logo imprinted on it, and a pin spanner to take the top off, which I've misplaced here, and I can't do any. Oh, there it is. A little 3-pin spanner to open it up. Now you don't have to have either of those. You can get by with a stubby screwdriver, which will engage at least one of those slots on the adjuster cap, as we'll see in a moment, and you can use a small pin face spanner to engage 2 of the 3 slots in the titanium top. So you can loosen it this way, or you can take James's tool and fit that in there and spin this open. But let's take a look in this puppy right now. When we take the top off, we see a very familiar mechanism if you know the D400. We've got this adjustment mechanism right here. And as I say, you can put a screwdriver on it, or you can put James's tool and open this up, and we'll see our valve internals immediately. So I'll unscrew that. And I realize now that I'm doing this, I forgot to test this. I wanted to show you. I've just lost my opportunity. This valve was tuned to 0.4 inches, and I wanted to put that on the gauge tonight. We'll have to do that in a little bit. But let's pull the poppet out very gently. And we see the first advantage that this poppet has over the D400 series. If you see that delicate knife edge inside, when technicians wanted to repair this regulator, they had to figure out a way to take the poppet and replace it inside. And without a stalk to grab onto, and I know that's not why they put it on here, it's just an accessory benefit, there was no way to drop that in without banging the metal bottom of the poppet against the knife edge. Now you could take a pair of forceps or surgical forceps to grab it. And in fact, that's what I use to reinsert a D400 poppet, but it's still very easy to ding that knife edge. Well, what have they done? They've thought about it. They put a nice soft plastic bottom on this, which in addition to being low friction, also protects the knife edge during poppet insertion. They have this guide, which is what helps keep the poppet aligned as you remove it, but it also becomes very easy to put this back in place when you reassemble it. The cover is a simple pinch to remove. If I just pinch it here, you can see that it separates a little bit. I just get my fingernail underneath it, lift the cover right off. And that is so much easier than removing the case of the D400 that already I'm sold. It's just fantastic. The first thing we notice is that the size of the diaphragm in this baby is much larger than the D400 that I've misplaced in the shop already. What did I just do with it? Well, you can take my word for it. There's a picture later. Oh, here it is. The diaphragm is much larger. So that heads us down that exhalation work of breathing path that we'll return to in a minute. The rest of the regulator comes apart with fingers without tools. You just lift out this little retainer. Lift off diaphragm retainer. The diaphragm itself is keyed so that you can't put it in the wrong position. There's a little nipple on the top of it. And the reason that's there is because the diaphragm is engaged on the bottom with the lever with this little loop, which is reminiscent of the D400. So you have to be sure to re-engage this lever with that loop, and that lever will be standing proud if the poppet were in with the spring. You can see how light this spring is, very light spring. The whole mechanism comes out with a little thumb pressure, and the whole thing pulls right out, and you can see this huge venturi opening right here. But everything else begins to look very familiar. There's our D400 housing, there's our TFX housing. This one's titanium with a removable knife edge. This one has the metal knife edge, or else that plastic piece of junk that was the last D400 model that the Regs learned to hate, the techs learned to hate. The lever is polished. I think this is a zirconium coating if I think about the rest of the things that that Atomic does. I called it gold at the beginning, but I realized it's probably zirconium, but it's very slippery, very smooth, and you can see the cam on here. It's very subtle, but you can see the cam bump, so that when you flex this lever, not only does it rotate, but that cam bump now becomes highest and gives you an extra probably 30%. The scary part for most technicians is removal of the venturi assembly, and many Regs have come to me with these little legs broken off. But in fact, this looks to be fairly simple to remove and slightly more robust than its predecessor. The venturi sleeve will come off with just a little gentle spreading. I'm not going to do it here because if I crack it, I can't get another one. There's no service manual, much less extra parts are there. So I'm just going to leave that alone and let you take my word for it on that. The next cool piece is the orifice. The orifice, as they have touted, is nominally floating. They said that it takes the pressure off the seat when it's not pressurized. And I'd like to think that IP behind this broad orifice puts a little extra pressure on it. I guess it's true, but I don't see, there's nothing that would make this retract on depressurization like the wave spring used in their end balanced regs. So I'm going to take that claim with a grain of salt. But as you can see, if we remove this by slipping a little pick underneath it, all we have to do is pull out this little retaining spring. See if I can keep that from flying across the shop. Then I can just take my crochet hook, plastic, so not metal, and lift this titanium orifice out. It's just a thing of beauty. It's a thing of beauty. As always, when I'm servicing regs, I'm going to take my most delicate components and they get a special place. Anything that I can damage gets protected. And so I'm going to put this titanium orifice in here with the plastic Scubapro one, just so I don't actually ding it with a piece of metal. This housing will tolerate anything I can throw at it now because there's nothing on it that requires sealing. As you saw in this picture that I think we put on Scuba board, the side wings that are flexible silicone bonded to a very durable plastic. This is a single unit. This comes out if you unscrew those screws, and you can see them sitting right here, and they've got a little plastic tab on it. And one of the big questions that's going to be in our minds is how durable this will be over time. And this is a nice tight bond. It's a single unit, but it's also not, $100 to replace if it gets damaged. I think there's a fair question as to, how durable this will be when it gets banged around the dive boat on a trip, and that's a fair question. I think if you look at the glass reinforced plastics that these regs are made of, there's no reason to think that this is any inferior to the G250, which, this reg is 35 years old, and other than scratches, it's just, you can't kill it. And for most of the case, you can, well, first of all, you can dive without this cover if you had to, but the case is similarly very heavy, and these wings, although critical to the operation, are not hugely expensive. And so unless you think that Atomic is going out of business, you'll be able to get these replaced for as long as you and I are around. The interesting thing at this point that's worth looking at is the internal volume of this case. This case is very small inside compared with an end-balanced reg. There is no volume in here. And so once again, airflow is going to be right out the mouthpiece, and this just becomes a vacuum chamber to suck in the diaphragm and trigger more venturi. It's going to be interesting to see what that looks like dynamically, and we'll do a little bit of that tonight. The remainder of the disassembly is similarly simple. We just put a 1/8 inch X key in the end, and that takes care of the little end cap. We'll grab a pair of circlip pliers and grab this little retainer right here. If I can keep that from flying across the shop, we're okay there. And the venturi vane just pulls out. It's got an O-ring seal on it, very straightforward. And it's got this mating device here, which is mated to a flat on the shaft. And let's go ahead and remove that before we try and disassemble it. So I'm going to pluck off this O-ring. This O-ring is not necessary unless you use the comfort swivel. This is the seal for the comfort swivel, and that's the one concern I have, that seals against the regulator by capturing this O-ring between the outside of the comfort swivel and the shaft of the inlet. Unlike a regular hose, which bonds to the inside and will tolerate a couple of millimeters of unscrewing before it leaks. So this requires firm snugging up. This trim ring is just decorative, and now you can see the square boss that prevents over tightening of an extra hefty diver putting his hoses on from changing the orientation of the barrel. At this point now we can just push the mechanism out and pop off this little linkage, and you can see all the O-ring seals. We're done. We've taken this baby apart. It's completely disassembled except for the except for the exhaust wings, and I'm not going to do that just to maintain the threads on the plastic barrel. That's as hard as it gets. Putting it together is no harder, and let's look at some of the things we've discovered. The poppet, I don't know how it's going to arrive from the factory. It is not a one-piece poppet, and the reason that's the case is because you need to be able to replace the seat. The seat is hiding right in here, and as the advertisement suggested, is reversible. So I'll take my 5.5 millimeter socket, and you want a long socket so that this guiding shaft doesn't run up against your socket. And if we take that off, we have the cap that is true to both the D400 and the TFX. We have this little tiny sealing O-ring on the top, and this seals the seat to that cap mechanism. I'm going to pull that off as gently as I can, although I have got that one in replacement because it appears to be exactly the same size as that used by the D400, and we have our seat. The seat is reversible, so I can use this side, I can use that side, and I don't know how the service manual will specify the seat, whether the seat comes with the service kit or only comes with every other service kit, or how they're going to do that. But the point is, you can make that last twice as long just by flipping that around. We've measured these O-rings. These O-rings are not all AS 450 or 568 O-rings. There's some British standard 1.6 cross sections. There's some metric ones, but nothing that's not obtainable by anyone who wants to try and make their own pirate kit. But the similarity between that and the D400 seat is obvious. The D series went through 5 different seat styles, trying to get it right. And I'll just show that just as a little demo. We had 4 or 5 different poppet designs, some that were one piece, all that eventually came as a single unit, whether or not they were disassemblable, but many of the later ones were paint bonded together so that you were obviously not supposed to disassemble them, but you could because they came with seats of multiple types. They did everything as they worked from 300 to 350 to 400, trying to get as light a seal as possible. And then finally they gave up. They put a nice firm rubber in there. We had that silly Delrin seat in the last iteration that required a fair amount of force to seal against, and you could kiss 0.6 inches goodbye. And so much as I loved it, I was not sorry to see the last version of the D400 go, but this return is a question. I think the only question in my mind is the purge button. You know, we've had enough problems with purge plastics over the years. The initial Atomic T1, TI2 had plastic that would crack. This is an interesting bonded design. It's very clearly a flexible plastic bonded to a firmer plastic. It's a single unit. You cannot disassemble this. And maybe you need to lay in a spare of this. We'll see what time says over this, but this is a very firm mechanism, and I have disassembled this regulator and reassembled it a dozen times since I've owned it. So it's gone through 12 services already on the original set of parts, and like I say, I was still able to tune it to 0.5 inches before I forgot and unscrewed it. We've already talked about the titanium orifice. In fact, the orifice was almost as good as advertised. This is the way it came out of the regulator, and I have to admit, when I disassembled the reg, the very first thing I did was put it under the microscope. And you can see that even as nicely manufactured as it is, there are some tiny machine marks on here. When my reg arrived, it was tuned to 1.3 inches. I thought that was extreme. and I did my initial test with it at 0.7, which was probably a little too hot. But the point is, an orifice like this sealed at 0.7, and that's a testament to the seat compound they use. Well, yesterday, since I'd reassembled this so many times and I was having trouble getting it below 0.7 or 0.6 inches before the seminar, I decided to do the same dressing technique that I use on Mark 25 pistons, on D400s, and I put it under the micro mesh, and this is about 20 minutes work with micro mesh on the end of a pencil, just a little bit of polishing, and you can see you've eliminated the factory machining marks completely. And of course, the shop won't do this for you, but before I blew it, I was hoping to demonstrate that I had this regulator down to 0.4 inches when you all came in tonight. Let's open the floor to questions. Everybody, just feel free to open your mic and jump in, and we'll chit chat about stuff.
Hey Rob, it's JD Dave Rothschild.
Yes, yes, sir.
Looking at the seat, I'm wondering, with a little bit of careful, judicious boring of that center washer, if they could be put into use for the D series.
I don't think there's any reason why you couldn't. What Dave is talking about is taking this seat with its bonding to a titanium core, and there's a little flange. If you look at the schematic, there's a little flange going through the middle of that, and you could spin that out and use that on a D series. But to be honest with you, there's still hundreds of D series seats that are still out there. And although they're getting old, I can still get 0.6 inches out of my D series seat. But yes, I think you could, and then have a reversible seat with that. Would be a nice cheat. Is James here tonight? I don't see him. Is he on the list? Oh, James is here. Yes. James, you want to share what you've done for us? Go ahead and come off of mute.
Hello. Before I mess with anything that I had been doing, I had a question on the center balancing theory. When you talked about
Okay.
how light the balance forces end up being with the center balance compared to end balancing, is that going to make it less responsive as an overpressure valve? Talking about how the big disparity in the end balancing helps with it being a pressure release. If you have a runaway IP, will a center balance
Yes.
pop off as
A center
easily?
balance pops off as at a higher absolute intermediate pressure than an end balanced design. If one is popping off around 220, the center balance may pop off around 300. I haven't tested the TFX yet, but typically if you run the numbers, because of that lack of disparity between the top and bottom forces, you're exactly right. Very, very good question. It will pop off at a higher pressure, but it's still within hose limit safety. I mean, it's designed that way so that
Still
it
should
goes
protect
before
the
you hit the
hose.
400. It will. Now, if you have a bang opening and a sudden surge in pressure, you may break your second stage or your hose before it can respond as it's designed to. It is designed for a gradual increase over a second or 2 seconds. But to be honest with you, I've done the same thing with an end balanced reg. When my very first days as a service technician, I had a poorly adjusted first stage, and I was in my instructor's shop, and I exploded an S-wing poppet, the little white poppet. Um, I exploded the shaft because I went boom to 280 psi, and the shaft just exploded. And then I put a new one in and said, "Oh dear!" And I didn't realize what was causing the problem, and I exploded the second one. My instructor was not happy, but that became a great show and tell at the next technician training, because the trainer made the statement that it was perfectly active as a safety pop off, and you could not destroy that poppet. And fortunately, I had a picture on my cell phone of 2 poppets with cracks in the shaft, and somebody had to eat crow, and he was pissed at me for the rest of the seminar. But that's the way it goes.
if I may drop in on that same subject, this is Lewis. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I can.
Okay. Yeah. So that was when the balance regulators, that was a big issue and a big discussion. And at the same time, octopus were coming around. And I mean, that's always been a discussion that well, now I'm assuming that nobody would have two of the center balance as their primary and their octopus. I'm assuming that that would never be the case. And for the longest time, I mean, when they designed the balance, the end balance regulators, the subject of overpressure was a big selling point that you could still. I mean, they could have done it more balanced, and there was a European. I believe that was tried. I'm talking about not even the center balance. I'm talking about there were, but the bias to be able to become a relieving, overpressure relief valve was part of the selling point back, when they're first coming out. Even then, having a non-balanced octopus has always been kind of except that now that becomes a problem with if you have the first stages that overpressurize. But anyway, that's
that's over the head of about 95% of the diving public in terms of how they would choose the regulator. They'll choose by brand and they'll choose by what the dive shop recommends, but you're absolutely right. If you're really thinking about emergency situations, even though 2 TFXs on my chest, if I could afford that, would eventually respond, the center balance mechanism responds at a higher pressure. And if you wanted something that would pop off at the first time your IP went to 160 or 170, that would be a downstream regulator that's only tuned to tolerate IP up to 145, 150, 155, and that would give you the best safety. Then you can devolve into the argument about, okay, I'm going to be in an emergency and I'm going to hand my primary off to my victim and I'm going to take my secondary, which in this case now is a downstream reg. When I'm half panicked or helping rescue him, do I want something that will or won't breathe as well? And that's where you're obligated to tune your downstream second stage frequently enough that its performance doesn't degrade as that seat takes an indentation. And that too would be a 95% versus 5% of the public who don't bring their downstream second back for service or for tune-up, but once every 2 years. And that's a mistake. Downstream seconds need regular tuning every 3 to 6 to 9 months because of that problem. But that's absolutely right, Luis. All right, James, what have you got for us in your magic?
I think George was trying to get in on the balancing conversation.
Was he? I missed that. Okay, George, jump in here.
No, actually, it's okay. I had a question about the floating orifice, but we can do this later. Let's hear from James.
Oh,
Whatever you want to do.
All right, then. Okay, then. You showed the floating orifice, right? And I thought it's going to behave the same way like the regular atomics. But you said you take it with a grain of salt. So did you notice anything? Does it do anything?
I can't tell because it's hidden under use. Let me grab it and put it back while we're looking here on camera. If I go to the overhead and sacrifice your view, as I put this back in place.
Oh, right.
Yes. So the distance that it can move in the housing is about 1 millimeter. And I haven't noticed that when I first pressurize this regulator that there's a little pfft, like a Poseidon does, where this has to seal, or even like an atomic does, where the floating orifice takes a fraction of a second to seal up with IP against there. So how much this is moving is open to some debate. It might move as much as a 0.5 millimeter. Therefore, it might sort of be depressurizing. But for certain, there is nothing that's pushing that orifice out of the way when the reg is depressurized. There's nothing that stops the poppet from coming down harder against it because you still have that spring behind it. So I don't think you're going to have much improvement in seat wear during storage compared to Atomic's other design. I think the floating orifice thing is a little bit of marketing hype.
Go ahead.
The only thing that comes to mind is that here we're dealing with a lighter spring pressure than with the regular Atomics like a T3. And if the spring pressure is lighter, it probably doesn't need as much travel to release all the pressure. So maybe something like this is going on.
Unfortunately, when you screw this down, you see that the working position of the spring is not between 0 and a little, but it's between a little and a little bit more. So it's still under a fair load. So I don't think that will turn out to be true, but we're getting into esoterica at this point.
One quick question on that. Are those, when you put in that pin, isn't that pushing down that orifice?
No, it just serves as a restraint. It doesn't touch it. Now, after it's pressurized, I think it will touch it. The orifice will pop up against the pin. So there's potentially a 0.5 millimeter space there.
It looks like that right there, you pushed it in. It looks like there is a spring action to the edges of the orifice.
I wish that were true, but I think it's just a fractional clearance. Yeah. And I think normally this rests up against those bars or probably not against the bars. It probably rests up against the seat. So the extent to which it floats is debatable.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, Rob had asked me.
James, you're on, James.
Well, Rob had asked me, since I have a problem with looking at old regs and can't help but tinker, try to find ways to keep them in service. And with the D400s, the issue was brought up that the only thing preventing it, let me see if I can get rid of my background quick, because it's keeping it from showing anything that I hold up. I apologize for that. I also apologize for having to see the mess of my hobby room. But so apparently the only thing preventing the TFX diaphragm from fitting in a D400 is the actual diaphragm retainer, with that central opening being sized for the smaller exhaust valve. And Rob generously sent me 400 and a couple of unserviceable parts to use for measurements. And I was able to model and recreate the factory. Sorry, I am terrible at getting things in view for the camera. So that's a parts interchangeable factory replacement that then, with measurements from Rob, that gives us a castellated, resized, that'll fit the TFX diaphragm. So hopefully tomorrow or Friday, I will be able to get 1 or 2 of those in the mail to Rob, so he can see how they fit and suit, if that'll work with them. And another of the things that I tinker with is making printing molds so I can cast silicone. Like, that's just a dive knife retainer that came out of a mold, but that casting silicone that I use has a fairly ridiculous amount of stretch. So I'm going to take measurements off of one of the original D400 covers and see if I can make a mold for it and make replacements in silicone that'll help solve the pain in the ass to get on and off covers for the 400s. So that, hopefully, for those of us who can't spend the money on a TFX, can put the D400s back in service and more easily maintained, and possibly even improved with TFX diaphragms.
That is just terrific news. That really is terrific news, and I'm very excited about it because I think it'll be a while before the TFX goes mainstream, and that will be interesting to see. No doubt about it.
I could probably ramble more, but this being focused on the 400 and TFX stuff. If you had any questions, I'd be happy to answer, but it's obviously not my show.
Quite all right. I think it's very exciting because if the more interest we can stir up in the center balance design, there's nothing about the D400 that's problematic except for its exhalation work of breathing, and that's only problematic on the Spiegel Grove, at 120 feet in current. So I think it remains a tremendous regulator if we can just figure out a way to make it work.
Rob, whoops.
Yeah.
Sorry, having a better look at the TFX exhaust setup. This is the first time I've seen the level of detail that you showed. It may be something we could do to get a similar exhaust path out of the D400, just with a completely different cover design than it started.
Okay. I think that would be very cool. And then all we have to do is figure out how to get gray market diaphragms from Atomic for the competition's old regulators, but that's a separate topic. It's an interesting one. All right. There was another question out there.
Yeah, Rob, it's Rob Jacoby. How you doing?
Doing fine.
I am. I now have my TFX in hand, and I'm waiting for James' wonderful adjustment. I call it adjustment knob, James. That doesn't do it justice. Are you going to talk after we take our bio break, Rob, about making the adjustment, or do I just wing it?
I have some slides at the end. I figure that will be more than most of the audience can stomach, and so what I've done is I've got a few more slides and some demos to look at from the gas bench, and we'll call it quits for the evening. But I figured that somebody like you, Rob, would have that question, and I've got another dozen slides on tuning and reassembly and adjustment that I think are important for those of us that like the D400, because the devil was in the details with that regulator. Indeed, when the D420 first came out, the service manual said, put the lever up against the set screw and have it sit with no waggle. And that's wrong. It's just wrong. And we were able to demonstrate that. I had some discussions with Scubapro. I'm going to assume that it wasn't my comments, but in fact, they discovered it for themselves. That was a very unstable way to maintain the D420. It flew in the face of what we knew from decades of maintaining the D400. And so there's no reason that it would have been different with the D420. And what we found is that when you screwed down the faceplate on the D420, it put enough pressure on the lever to eliminate your waggle room with your lever. And now screwing in the top adjuster, increasing spring pressure, didn't do anything because you couldn't move the poppet anymore. You couldn't bury the poppet seat against the knife edge any tighter because it was constrained by the set screw. And that was a mistake in the manual that when they came out with version 2 of the manual about a year later, suddenly there was a 2mm lever drop that was specified. And so that was heartening to see that what we knew all along was true is still true. And that applies to the TFX as well. Yeah, we can spend, just you and me, if you're the only one left, we can spend 10 slides worth at the end of the evening and look at some pictures on how that plays out.
I'll stay
All
on
right,
for it.
it's
I come back just 1 second.
Yeah.
It's
Sure.
back to the question of the seat saver. If I were to lend my brand new and soon to be beautifully tuned TFX to my granddaughter, put her on the dive boat, where I live up in the Keys, I'm always worried when she has her T2X that she's going to have to, she's going to be with somebody on one of the dive boats without me. she's going to get the backflow of water into it. What's what I'm getting around to because of the wave spring. So since you're saying there really isn't much impact on the TFX of the so-called seat saver, do you think there's any chance of that sort of backflowing of water if one of the dive attendants inappropriately puts it in the tank?
No, as long as they haven't left the cap off the first stage. You know, if wash water travels 3 inches, 6 inches, all the way up to the first stage for that matter, from rinse water, you know, i.e. non-salt water, it's a piston. You fire that up, you pressurize it, and poof, it just blows it right back through. You're not going to freeze up that regulator, and if it wasn't salt water, you're not going to damage the regulator. And if it's titanium, even if it was salt water, you're not going to damage it. So the seat saver risk of dunking it when it's unpressurized is an imaginary horrible. Yeah, she needs to take some modest care to say, don't dunk my reg when it's off the tank. Or if you do, just dunk the second stage and then hang it with the second stage hanging lower than the first stage so that it drips dry. But the first time you pressurize it and purge it, it just blows itself dry. It's a non-problem.
Perfect.
Okay, I will see you guys at, so it's 8:30, 11, I'm sorry, 8:23, 11:23. I'll see you at 8:30, 11:30 for the last little run around. We're on the home stretch here, except for the hangers on for the tuning discussion, but let's run quickly through some interesting stuff. This will take us about 20 minutes. I guess we're running a little bit long, but that's okay. What are the challenges facing the TFX as a replacement wonder? I mean, you look at the Mark 25 as a first stage, and it's become the most popular first stage in the world. My arguments about unsealed pistons notwithstanding. The disassembly of the TFX, you saw how easy it was. If you look over my shoulder, you'll see that the TFX is already back together. And on the first stage, it took me about 8 minutes to put back together, even at, you know, my level of experience. I've only done it a few times, but it's already back together. It took about 8 minutes to put back in and tune. So that's just not a problem. The fragile knife edge is an issue. I mean, I felt obligated to dress mine to make it perfect to see if I could get 0.4, and I could. That's with, you know, a rig that's been reassembled 12 times now since I bought it and messed with. The alignment is great. So if you ding the knife edge, you can buy a new one. If you have a little micro mesh, you can dress it. But it's got no diver adjustment knob. You know, if you look at the G260, it doesn't have a way to crank down on cracking effort and prevent free flow on giant stride. So I thought one of the first things we would look at is that very phenomenon. Here's the Venturi mechanism for the TFX, and 2 people have already pointed out on Scubaboard that, God, it only goes 1/4 of an inch. It goes from, you know, 4 boxes down to 2 boxes and doesn't crank a whole 1/4 of a turn. And you can see what the Venturi vane does inside the regulator between maximum on the top and minimum on the bottom. And that's an important distinction that once again has been lost on the diving community. In the old days, the G250 didn't come with a vane. If you look at my G250, this is along with my D350, the first regulator I ever dove, and it's still here. And you can see it doesn't have a diver adjustable vane. That vane has nothing grabbable. I guess I could grab it with a pair of pliers, but the point was, as a diver, I wasn't supposed to. And instead, the service manual had these instructions for the technician. Back when we were thinking technicians, it's always advisable not to set the Viva beyond X level when the second stage is returned to your customer. In other words, it's supposed to auto shut off once you bang on the purge button and generate a free flow, because all good regs should in fact generate a free flow when you bang on it. And if yours doesn't, it's not probably got the optimal lever height, or it's got a poor initial design, but it should free flow. And I think it's important that we look at that right now. Let's take a look at the bench behind me, and where I've got it set up here. I've got it set up here with the TFX on a little suck device connected to the MagnaHelic. For demonstration purposes, it's also connected to a little electronic pump here that I can generate suction and talk at the same time. But the point is, how do we measure cracking effort? We watch the intermediate pressure gauge as an indicator for the moment the valve opens. And when the valve opens, whatever we're reading on the suck gauge, the MagnaHelic gauge, is what our cracking effort is. So if we zoom in on this and get a good close look at both the IP gauge and the MagnaHelic, I'm going to turn on the pump and see what happens. This reg has just been quickly reassembled, so it's probably going to crack around 1 inch. You can see I've got an IP of around 133.5. Now watch that IP gauge. When it starts to change, because this is a very carefully calibrated pump, so I can increase my suck very slowly. And you see it's holding at 133.5, 133.5. And I've got a MagnaHelic of around oh, there it is. The needle's moving at 0.55. So I've got a cracking effort of 0.6 after just a slam bang reassembly. If I back off on it a little, let's try it again and see. You'll see the IP start to creep back up again. So now we'll come back again. Let's see if it's actually 0.5. It might be just a hair lower. It's at 0.5 and the needle is moving. The needle is moving. So cracking effort for this regulator right here is 0.5 inches. Just magnificent. But let's retune this rig just on the fly. And then let's take a little check, because I think that's kind of fun to look at. One, it'll show you how easy it is to tune this regulator. But two, we're going to talk a little bit about Venturi. If I take the top off, and the nice thing about this is that it's not like an end balanced. If I crank in the orifice on an end balance, I'm going to drop the lever. I'm just going to add 3/4 of a turn, okay? Just a big honking correction. So now I know it won't be 0.5 inches anymore, but it probably won't be 1.3 either. Let's check and see where we are. There we go. Okay, about 0.8 inches. It's dropping. It's probably about closer to 0.7 inches. But the point is, we have now a hot-tuned TFX. So with this hot-tuned TFX,
you move your camera.
Yes?
You moved your camera.
I'm
we
sorry.
cannot see. Sorry.
Okay. What would you like? I guess we'll not look at the regulator. We'll just look at the gauges there. I apologize. So there's reg off. IP creeping back towards 133. It's rising. It's rising. Pump back on again at 0.8 inches. The needle is just drifting down. So the valve is just cracked open. So this is set for about 0.85. I apologize. Thank you, Luis. So we have a hot-tuned TFX, but that's not what I really wanted to show you. What instead I wanted to show you, I don't know if you'll be able to hear it, but I'm going to try it. It may overcome the Vox on my machine. As you can see behind me, I've got 1500 of PSI, kind of mid-tank pressure set. I got a full tank, but I'm just going to demonstrate this with mid-tank performance. I've got the Venturi set on this at full. In other words, if you look in the hole, I don't know if you can see it in the light, the vein is pointing straight at my mouth. So it's wide open. And when I bang on this, I don't know if it'll overcome or you'll be able to hear it, but here we go. Nope. Now, what did just happen? I don't know what you could hear with that, but it took me a little effort to bang and initiate a Venturi. But once I got it going, I had to move the vane, as you can see, less than half a box to shut it off. More like a quarter of a box. It's wide open. And it shut itself off at less than half a box. That's how sensitive this regulator is to Venturi manipulation. It creates enough turbulence with that little minimal movement of the vane to eliminate the suck and the free flow self-extinguished. Now, what does that mean in diving terms? We have to keep in mind the configuration of this diaphragm. If you're going under the water, you haven't even submerged yet. You're 1.5 inches under the water. You're already over cracking effort. This regulator is going to free flow if your mouth isn't on it because the diaphragm is lowest. That is, if you will, the penalty for this design, which is also the same advantage that makes it so easy to breathe under the water. The diaphragm is lowest in the water column. The valve is already open. It's wanting to help you breathe. But if it comes out of your mouth, it's going to free flow in this position. Why? Because you've got 2 full inches between the diaphragm and your mouthpiece. The valve is open. It's lower in the water column. How do you shut that off? Well, you can't shut it off just by changing the Venturi to minimum, although changing it to minimum has some interesting effects we'll look at on the video in just a moment. You're still, even if you do that, the cracking effort is still 0.7 inches or 1.3 inches. It doesn't matter. It's still more than the distance from here to here. You don't shut the valve off that way. You shut it off by turning it upside down. We all know that. But here's the problem with this design, or not the problem, but the relearning that has to take place if you're going to buy this regulator. If we take a standard regulator like this Deep 6, which is free flowing, and we turn it over, as we start to rotate it into the position, the diaphragm is still higher than the mouthpiece. When we get to here, the bubbles in the bottom of the case are lower than the mouthpiece, and the bubbles start to come out and water starts to go into the case. And by the time we're here, the case is already filling full of water. And by the time you get back here, the case is completely flooded. Now you're underwater, of course, when you're doing this. You turn it back upside down when it accidentally free flowed in your octopus position, and it just sits there full of water and everything's fine. With this design, you have a little challenge in that regard. The diaphragm is lowest, and you want to invert it and fill it full of water. If you take the standard technique and rotate it, the diaphragm is already lower in the water column than the mouthpiece. And by the time you get to here, before any significant bubbles can come out, the valve is kicking in because the center of the diaphragm is more than 1.2 inches above the mouthpiece at that point. You can never rotate this to the standard position like you do this reg to flood it and keep it from fluid flowing. It's very frustrating if you're used to doing that in the water column. And so that's not the technique you use for this regulator. If you want to flood this regulator after a free flow, you've got to do it sideways instead. When you rotate it this way, the diaphragm is still higher. The case is half there, and by the time you get to here, before the center of the diaphragm gets lower than the mouthpiece, bubbles are already starting to come out of the case. And by the time you get to here, the case is filling full of water, pressing against the diaphragm from the inside, and you can get rid of the last bubbles just by completing it this way. So for this regulator, we just do the standard technique from inverted, flip it over, and it floods on the way up. For this regulator, you do exactly the same thing, but you have to do it from the side instead of front to back. That's the only change in technique you have to use. And this is how I managed this regulator when I had it hot tuned for my demo in the pool when I did that full test, and I had it set to 0.7 inches. It drove me nuts. It was so skittish, or it seemed so skittish. I was just doing it the wrong way. I just had to flood it this way, and then it was no problem. Because just like any hot tune reg, these want to open the valve when there's air in the chamber. And before people start dissing the Atomic for its fault in this regard, you just have to learn a new technique. It's not this standard technique, it's this standard technique. Very simple. But I thought it was really cool that it took a quarter of a turn to shut this down. And that's how I'm going to dive this coming off the boat. I can put it to minimum, knowing that that's so much turbulence. Apart from getting it submerged and having ambient pressure press on this, nothing else is going to open this up. I'm not worried about this regulator. If I hang this on my dive, on my gear like this, or like this in the patty position and have something dangling on it, it'll fill full of water before. This isn't going to take a whack from the sea. It's not going to sit there on my regulator like this, or it probably shouldn't. We'll see. But the point is, there's an easy way to flood this regulator. It's just different from what we're used to. So very sensitive venturi, different technique for flooding. And let's look at a few more slides and quit for the night. If you're a fan of Peter Wolfinger and bought his book, you'll see that towards the end, after he goes through painful detail about regulator theory and design, he talks about dynamic testing. And he was unique in doing this. He's not a hydraulic engineer. He's not an air fluids engineer. He's an OJT, very smart guy. But he designed this to assess what we just looked at. When does a regulator shift into free flow? And we've looked at this in our earlier Regulator Geeks sessions. When you start breathing really heavily at depth with thick air, you've got a lot of air molecules passing by that valve. Using Reynolds numbers and some guesswork, we can say that there is a rough equivalence between an ANSTI test and maybe about 35 cubic feet a minute flowing at surface pressure between a surface test and some point on the ANSTI loop. But more to the point, what is this regulator's performance compared to others that we've looked at? If we're going to compare apples to apples, let's just look at it the same way we look at the G260 or the Atomic in terms of regulator initiated free flow. If you look in, this is the left-hand side of our bench that we weren't dealing with, and here's a rotameter that contains a calibrated flow meter from 0 to 14 cubic feet a minute. And keep in mind that if you suck in as fast and hard as you can, you might approach 4 to 6 cubic feet a minute for a fraction of a second. This will generate that continuously. So it's double or triple your maximum possible physical flow at the surface on a continuous basis. Let's also remember what we see when we do a cracking effort. Cracking effort is a static measurement that shows the amount of suck required to open the valve. But what happens once the valve is open? The regulator wants to deliver air, and then venturi kicks in, pulling the diaphragm in and opening the valve even more, and something is going to happen to this magnehelic. It'll either be hard to breathe and you'll have to suck hard to keep the valve open, or it will want to free flow at you and go into positive territory, this left-hand side of the scale, because it's blowing at you. And how that performs is how a regulator feels underwater. And Mr. Wolfinger had this idealized set of graphs, and on the left is a poorly designed or old style diaphragm, old style downstream second stage. The valve opens, it's got a constant spring. It doesn't have much venturi assist because we didn't know much about that in 1962. And the harder you have to suck, the harder it is to suck because you're moving more air through, and the amount of negative pressure you have to generate is higher at high flows. Now, the unusual thing about this graph you have to realize is that going up is more suck. It's more negative. So this is negative territory in white and positive territory in gray. Everything's inverted logically, and you need to understand that. His ideal design, by contrast, would say, okay, if this is what's happening, let's have venturi help us out. And the more air you have flowing through the case, the more the valve will want to open due to venturi effects on the lever, and it'll get easier to breathe. And if you don't design it just right, you may have a rig that kicks over hard into free flow and then starts blowing at you. And if it starts blowing at you early in the breathing cycle, that can be very uncomfortable. And we actually saw that on the Spiegel Grove with the C350, a downstream regulator that was really, really strong Venturi effects, and it was hot tuned. This thing shifted over, and during a heavy breath at 120 feet, it would want to blow at you, and it was quite uncomfortable. So in a previous session of the Regulator Geeks, we looked at this. Here's a standard TX100, you know, a regulator that's popular amongst tech diving crews all over the world. Where did I put it? And if you have the Venturi on or off, if you have it poorly serviced or well serviced, I don't know where I said it, it either looks like the curve on the bottom or the curve on the top. If it's on the top, when it's in this label corroded, the harder you suck, the harder it is to breathe from it at high flows, and it gets very uncomfortable. Once it's properly serviced and tuned hot, it gets easier and easier to breathe until way out, way beyond where we breathe at the surface, like 3 times as much, it finally crosses over into free flow. And we then, in a previous Regulator Geek session, looked at a bunch of different regulators. And we saw that the different designs were a little bit all over the map, except for this one group in what I called the sweet spot. There was a characteristic typical of Deep 6, of the G250, of the S720-270 that was very stable throughout the flow cycle, that they were so well designed, in the case of the D250, maybe accidentally, but in the case of the T2, on purpose, so that no matter how much flow you ran through that case, it would stay just the way you set it. Maybe a little Venturi assist, which you would say would be helpful with thick air at depth, but the point was it was stable. So we looked at the TFX this week with that very question in mind. How is it going to perform? I'm going to show you about 3 minutes worth of videos. It's going to come in 3 segments. The first is an actual speed test on the rotameter. And what you need to understand is that when I run these tests, they go through prodigious amounts of gas, huge amounts of gas. So that if I'm running, 15 cubic feet a minute for 5 minutes, I've just emptied an AL80. And in fact, by the last half of it, my first stage is really struggling to give me enough pressure to drive the thing. So these tests have to be very fast. A whole test is about 15 to 20 seconds long. So we're going to see that in real speed. And then when I photograph these for you tonight, I photograph them in slow motion so that I could run a quick test, and then I could look at the video afterwards and pluck out the numbers to plot the charts that we saw. And so we're going to see a real speed test. Then the next thing we're going to see is a TX100 with the Venturi turned off. In other words, just like an old style cheap reg that wasn't well designed. And we're going to see what the suck does at high flow, and then we're going to look at the TFX. So let's take a peek here and run the first one. Okay, this is a high-speed test in real time. There's no audio. I couldn't get the audio to work, but you see a reg was set to crack at around 0.9 inches, and this is all hand controlled, so it's not as smooth as it might be. But you can see I'm running the flow meter up, increasing the vacuum, and you can see that the magnehelic is starting to get a little harder to breathe, and then it takes a little drop. Something assists it as the Venturi kicks in, and boom, the test is over. Now, that's too much to keep track of in real time, and so as I say, you have to do that. Wrong movie. Let's try again. Now this is the TX100 with the Venturi turned off. It was tuned to about 1.5 inches, kind of poor, and the harder I suck, the higher the magnehelic gets. It's up to 2.5 inches. It's up to 3 inches. 3.5 inches for it. I mean, this is a typical old regulator. It gets really hard to breathe, and so if you were at depth on the Spiegel Grove in trouble trying to breathe that regulator, you would be freaking out. Now let's look at our TFX. The regulator is set to crack about 1 inch, and as the flow meter, this is slowed down now, so you can see it in real time. it's still 1 inch at 3 cubic feet a minute. That's the most 4 cubic feet is the most you could possibly breathe at the surface. By the time I hit 5 or 6, it's still 1 inch. This is as much as I could possibly breathe. Now you go to depth and you put in a little effort, maybe we're getting into this kind of territory. And now the Venturi is kicking in and it's dropping to maybe 0.8. As I get up to 10 cubic feet a minute, it's dropping to 0.7 or 0.6, and then suddenly it surges. There's a little boost in the item. Let's go back 10 seconds and play it again. And you'll see that around 12 cubic feet a minute, it shifts over into free flow. And now the magnehelic is in positive territory. How hard is it blowing at you? Well, only 3/4 of an inch. It's very tolerable. And no matter how high I drove it, I couldn't get it more than 1.5 inches of blow. Very comfortable. So now I did what I did with you when I shut the Venturi off. I did less than half a box, and it was about 1.2 inches. And as it climbed, it was still 1.2 inches. This is with insignificant tweak to that Venturi vane. It's still 0.9 inches. I'm up to 9 cubic feet a minute. This is huge gas flow. It seems there was a little surge there. It went up to 1.5, and then boom, it drops down to 0.6. So there's something happening in the case with the Venturi, but it still stays in positive territory. It's still very stable. And I drove it beyond the poppet up to 15 or 17 cubic feet a minute. I don't know because it's not on the scale, but it still never got any lower than 0.8 inches. It didn't kick over into free flow with just a fraction of change on the Venturi vane. Now I turned the Venturi down to minimum. And this is interesting to see because now I have a lot turbulent flow inside the regulator. By definition, you would never have it this detuned, which is why that valve is all you need. You can see at 6 cubic feet a minute, I'm breathing about 1.5. It's getting a little stiffer. It's not as bad as that TFX was, but it's getting a little stiffer. I'm up to 7 cubic feet a minute, still 1.5 inches, about as bad as a cheap octopus. So it gets to about this point, and finally the turbulence gets so out of control that the regulator starts to vibrate. It starts to do that honking thing, and you can see the water splashing out of the dish at that point, and I had to abort the test. That's with the regulator at minimum. So it was a fascinating set of tests, and the way that graphed itself out is about like this. The blue line was the TFX at full Venturi when it crossed over into a gentle free flow, 0.8 inches at 14 cubic feet a minute, and maybe 1.5 inches at 16. It was off my gauge. But the point is, it was about like the C350 was at full Venturi. That was the one that I said was a little uncomfortable to breathe on the Spiegel Grove when I was hyperventilating at depth. So this is a very powerful regulator, and this is why we need to remember that our Venturi adjuster, or as Scubapro calls it, the pre-dive switch at the top of your regulator, is not an on-off switch. It's a very subtle adjustment. So this regulator is capable of delivering huge flows under all conditions. And if you find yourself with uncomfortable free flow, all you have to do is dial it back a hair. If you're working in current and all of a sudden it starts to clatter at you, it can still deliver everything you need. You just need to tune it properly, or maybe you want to dive this one box off and it will stay as flat as can be. How do I know that? Because we tested it. If I put the TFX at 90% Venturi, it looks just like the T2, it looks just like the S620 Ti, it looks like all the best regulators. It's stable throughout the flow range, and that's just with a hair of tweaking. When we go to minimum Venturi, it starts to climb, and then it got into that vibration point when I'm cranking it, because this Venturi is so detunable that it'll induce turbulence inside the case, and that's not designed for use in high performance diving. It's designed for giant stride. Same thing. Remember the G250 slide that I showed you, the Viva instructions to the technician? This G250 graph the blue one, the light blue one, is with a properly tuned venturi, which is about 80% of maximum flow, because that's how I was taught to adjust the G250 to self-extinguish that free flow when I banged on the purge button, and tuned that way. It's perfectly stable. And the TFX, designed by another Scubapro engineer, this would be Dean Garaffa and this would be Doug Toth, two Scubapro guys who both went over into the atomic side. I have delivered a completely stable regulator with a properly tuned venturi valve. You need to know that that vane is not on-off. It's a fine-tune adjustment. Well, what's the last piece of this puzzle with regard to whether or not you can claim that the TFX is the last regulator you ever need to buy? What was the one unspoken problem, really unknown problem, about the D400? It was that small exhaust valve. The fact that with thick air at 120 feet, under max effort, you were having to push to get your breath out. And that, if you had to sustain that for 3 minutes, on top of using up all your gas and wearing yourself out, you'd be maybe accumulating some CO2. It made me start to say, God, the D400 was my favorite regulator of all time, but I don't think I'd want to take it to the Spiegel Grove anymore in current. It's great on inhalation, but on exhalation, when I'm working hard, it doesn't have the capability. And that was my worry about the TFX. Well, when you look at the numbers, the TFX diaphragm, exhaust valve, is bigger by about 9% greater circumference. And remember that the area for exhalation is not the area of the valve, but in fact the perimeter of the valve multiplied by valve lift. So with a 9% greater circumference and at least a 20%, maybe more like 33% greater valve lift, you have at least 44% more total flow out that exhalation valve when you run the numbers. That is great news. But it still doesn't address the problems that we looked in that slide earlier, where we noted that bubbles in the D400 had to go down before they went up. How did the TFX address that problem? Well, when you look at the TFX, you'll see that the design, and I don't have the heart to take my case apart again, so you're gonna have to rely on pictures. When you pluck off the diaphragm, you'll notice that around the perimeter of the case, you've got this lug that engages the retaining ring, and this lug, and this lug. You got 4 of them. But from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock, from 2:30 all the way around to 10 o'clock is wide open. And you've got exit paths in the wings there, in the bottom holes in the cover here, in the wing here, and then out the top, going out at the top of the wing. You have much better exhalation pathways compared with the D400. If you look at the D400 from the side, what you've got is this collar, and this collar didn't used to be this this tall. It started out only about 2/3 as high, and they found that in current, when air was coming through the side holes, if you were scootering or you turned their head to the side, that current could lift the exhalation valve and the reg would suddenly flood or breathe wet. So they raised this collar to eliminate that problem. But what that did is it created a circuitous exit pathway for exhaled gas. It would come out of this valve, then had to rise up the collar, go around the corner, and then out those 2 holes on either side of the case. That was pretty limiting, especially with a small exhaust valve, and gave rise to the sort of performance that I found so distressing in the Spiegel Grove. When I tested the TFX, by comparison, it had almost as good an exhalation effort as the D420. The D420 with its high exhaust valve is unbeatable. Even the S620 Ti can't do that. But I couldn't tell the difference between this and a G250 or a G260. It was close to effortless on exhalation. They fixed this problem. On top of it, they gave you a wing, which, as silly as it might look and as floppy as might worry some people, is also good at directing bubbles past your ear. Your eyeballs remain clear in the standard diving position. There are no bubbles with this regulator, and that is very cool. So when we finally ran the subjective numbers, and this is my Scuba Labs equivalent test, one guy's opinion, I found that on inhalation, the TFX was better than everything except for the the other Atomic. The other Atomic also was a 9.9 on heavy inhalation. On gentle inhalation, it was a 10 out of 10. You couldn't beat the TFX on noodling along under easy effort. It wants to help you breathe. But then heavy exhalation was my big worry, and you can see how the D400 is kind of starting to fall off. That's the thing that kind of scared me on the Spiegel Grove. The D420, by contrast, is better than any reg on the market. It's close to effortless, even when you're huffing and puffing. And I have to imagine this would be just as true at depth. That's the way it was for me on the Spiegel Grove. But if I compare all the other top-of-the-line regs, the C370, the T2X, the G250, the TFX matched it in terms of heavy exhalation, and that was the moment that I said, I like this regulator. It took the heritage of the Pilot and made it easier to service, made the valve relatively simple, and made it easy to take apart and put back together with a cracking effort that I had as low as 0.4 inches. Not that I dive it that way, but this is a magnificent valve. I think Atomic did it. And with James's tools, you can service it. You saw it took me 10 minutes to take it apart, talking all the while. It took me 8 minutes to put it back together and tune it for the next demo. It's pretty cool. That's all I got for you guys, aside from the tuning slides for the hangers on. Last round of questions before we say goodnight.
If nobody raised their hands, so great regulator, and also thanks for this amazing presentation. The only thing that puzzles me is the D400 could be set at what, 0.6 inch cracking effort, right? And then
Yes.
of course with the D420 we needed a higher one because of the case geometry. Here we have perfect case geometry. We have the same designers that made the D400, and yet you found that you have to set it at 1.1 inch. So what does that tell us? Does it tell us that flow, after all, is more important than cracking effort, or what's your conclusion from this?
My conclusion
are you sad
is,
that you can't set it that low anymore, like the D400?
you know, when I retuned the reg for my pool test to 1.1 inches, I couldn't tell the difference and anything but the most vigorous inhalation. And then it was about as bad as the T2X, which is to say not bad at all. It was great. But I think that the answer to your question lies here. It's very subtle. It's very subtle. But let's just take a position, a standard diving position. I think what we're seeing, and we're talking tenths of an inch here too, what we're seeing is that the D400 has a downward hanging diaphragm, just like the TFX, but the shape of the case is a little bit longer. And by that, I mean that the diaphragm is 1/2 an inch lower in the water column than the equivalent D400 in the same diving position. And this would be, let's make this one the worst case scenario for this diaphragm. Case geometry is 0, you're absolutely right. But this diaphragm is almost 1/2 an inch lower in the water column. So you put something that's 1/2 an inch lower in the water column and you try and do the same 0.6 inches, and the valve just wants to open too easily. That wasn't a problem when I had it in my mouth. I didn't mind running that reg as hot as 0.7 or 0.6. It didn't bother me. It just became a little difficult to control as soon as I took it out of my mouth. And then I had to learn that technique of doing the sideways flooding. But once I was used to it, did it bother me? No, but I can imagine a whole legion of haters saying, "Oh my God, it's too finicky. It's too delicate. I don't like it." When it's so easy to breathe. I think all we have here is just case geometry. This diaphragm is 1/2 an inch lower. It cracks even better than the D400. So if you're going to take it out of your mouth, you need to be prepared for that. And just invert it and then slowly, carefully flood it. You don't dive with the regulator out of your mouth, so who cares? Now, Luis's question is, what happens if you dive this as an octopus? That's a good question. And I'm going to take this to Cozumel in a month. And Luis will be there to laugh at me as I struggle. but we'll be playing together in Cozumel, and we can see how a hot tuned regulator performs. And if it's too hard, you saw how hard it was for me to tune this. I took the cap off, I gave it a half a turn with James's tool, put the cap back on, and I have retuned the regulator from 0.6 to what was it, 0.8 or 0.9 in 30 seconds. I mean, that's how hard it was to tune. And unlike your friend at the beach, I can't tell you how much I hammer this when we have the regulator classes. You've got a free flow in a standard N balanced regulator. And the guy who doesn't know anything about it says, I can fix your free flow. And he comes in and he gives you a half a turn on your orifice. And this regulator now has a lever which is sitting there. And you suck in and you can get a little air at the surface and your free flow went away. You take that regulator down to 60 feet at double gas density, triple gas density, and you're going to die because the valve will not open enough to give you thick gas at 60 feet. And so the guy says, I can fix your problem with a half a turn on the orifice. It's just killed you. Reg service is not rocket science, but it is very precise. And N balance regulator adjustment is done in 5-minute increments. Maybe another 5-minute increment. But anything beyond 5 minutes, the lever begins to drop. And that is the price you pay. And so people who were taught to fix free flow by screwing in the orifice are making terrible performing regulators. And the correct answer is you fix your free flow by just barely sealing it, and everything else is controlled with the spring. And if it's too light, too bad. You have to dive with the knob in a turn. You don't fix it by screwing in the orifice. This is technician proof. Once they learn the basics, you can screw in that adjuster all you want, and it doesn't affect lever height. It does a little bit, but in the opposite direction. And for those that hang around, we'll talk about that for 15 minutes. But this one is technician proof. This will not endanger you the way an N balance design will. I mean, everything about this design makes me love it. Center balance is shorter flow path. It's a lighter spring. It's better case geometry. It's better cracking effort. Why the G250 beat out the D400 is solely because of market forces. It was odd. It was ugly. It had that case that wouldn't come off, and technicians hated it. But this is a better valve, and Atomic has brought it back.
If I may add something on the case fault geometry, the case, so the case fault geometry, when you're talking about a concentric valve, is the diameter of the valve. So TF, because you're going to be at some point the valve will be vertical. So the distance from the center of the die. So you will have to. So you will have to. You cannot tune. You're going to have to tune
any lighter than 0.5 inches. Yes.
Yeah, you're going to have to tune it to the
radius. It has a maximum case geometry fault of 1/2 an inch. That is as low as you can go with this, or it will free flow in the vertical position.
Well, it's probably going to be a little bit worse than, because the D400 has a smaller valve. You can tune it without to a slightly that much, which is insignificant. A 1/10 of an inch or a 2/10 of an inch is nothing that a human can really sense.
You can't feel it.
But I'm just bringing that up as the difference that you can tune without getting bubbling at D400 a little bit lower because of the diameter, the radius of the valve.
Yes, the diameter of the valve. That's correct.
Yeah, I mean, that's so same thing as in a double hose, by the way, because the valve is in front, right in front, and the radius.
Luis, for everybody who doesn't know, Luis is our double hose expert. He has done technical diving using a double hose. He designed the Kraken, and he is a master at the double hose. So he's the guy.
I didn't mean to sidetrack,
no,
but
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. All right, guys. Thank you again for joining us. As I say, I'll stick around to have a little tuning discussion for those few that are interested in that level of minutia. But it's been fun having you, and I appreciate the interaction. Last questions before we call it an evening?
This was great stuff, Rob. Thanks for doing it for the community. We all appreciate it.
My pleasure, Matt. All right, I see a few folks dinging off. I'm going to start droning on, which will cause the rest of the audience to disappear in rapid succession. And so when there's nobody left on Zoom, I'll quit talking. How do you tune a valve like this? I think I've got about 20 minutes, sweetie. 20 minutes, maybe 15. I think the first thing you have to recognize with this valve is that the lever position, as in a end balance reg, is critical, but it's critical in a different sense. The set screw at the bottom of the regulator controls lever height, and showing you the D400 is no different from the TFX. There's a little tiny hex screw right at the bottom that controls the lever. And you can see that there's just a little bit of floppiness in this valve in this position. So the question is, how do you tune the TFX? Let's look at the minutia, and you'll see why. If you unscrew the set screw, quite obviously the fulcrum for the lever drops back and the lever falls. Nothing magical about that. But there's also something else that happens when you pressurize this regulator. Here is a slow-mo 1-second video. When you look at the, get rid of me. When you look at the mechanism, on the top is an unpressurized valve, and on the bottom is one where I've applied IP. When you apply IP, this little chamber goes up to 135 psi. And I told you that it's perfectly balanced. Well, almost. It's almost perfectly balanced. There's a slight diameter bias in favor of the top end with the seat compared with the bottom end. It's got to be that way if it's going to retain its safety valve component. Now it's being held back by this yellow spring, but when you pressurize this, that 1/2 pound of bias puts some pressure on the 1.5 pound spring, and the poppet moves. The poppet moves a fraction of a millimeter. If it moves too far, it'll come off the seat in your regular free flow, but assuming you have enough spring tension on here to keep it from unsealing, when it moves fractionally, your fulcrum pivot point moves away and the lever falls 2 millimeters. There is a real temptation amongst technicians to correct that. Why? Because they've learned on end balance valve assemblies. They know that lever height is critical, and so they're going to try and maximize lever height. And how do you do that? You screw in the hex. And by screwing in the set screw, you pin the head of that lever in tightly against the bottom of the poppet, and the lever comes up, and you say, oh, that's a good thing. Well, no, it's not. If you do it just a hair too much, and you've raised the lever up to what you think is optimum position, but you added 3 minutes too much on the hex screw, 10 degrees of turn too much, what's happening microscopically is that as you screwed that in, you engaged with the foot of the poppet and you pushed the poppet to the right. And when you push the poppet to the right, the knife edge disengaged from the seat and air escaped from the valve. So you think you're good here, you pressurized it, you tightened it up, and then when you put the diaphragm on, the linkage is putting just a hint of pressure on the lever, just enough to, milligrams of pressure, and that's enough to displace it. This becomes very unstable. So screwing in the spring adjuster is almost risk-free. When you screw in the spring adjuster, that's the black cap, it obviously compresses the spring. And when you compress the spring in a properly adjusted reg, it increases cracking effort. Why? Because it's harder for the poppet to move against that increased spring pressure. That makes sense. If you had a little slack in the lever, as you screw in this spring, it may tend to displace the seat back to the left a little bit. Why? Because of C. It's driving the knife edge into the seat, as we see here. It's driving that titanium knife edge into the rubber. And as a result, the foot of the poppet travels microscopically to the left and kicks the lever up. So you've got to have the sweet spot. And we found this out with the D420 when they prescribed having a lever that touched the back of the diaphragm. If you picture tilting this valve about 30 degrees to the right so that the lever's up in the air, you can picture it in your mind sitting underneath the cap of the diaphragm. And if you had that lever touching the disc of the diaphragm that high, it meant that the head of the lever was pinned between the set screw and the poppet. It was already pinned. There was no slack left. And then when you screwed down the faceplate, it added just a hint of dynamic rubber band tension to the lever because the faceplate was dimensionally slightly smaller than the diaphragm ring. It grabbed the skirt and it tensioned it up just a little bit. And so you'd measure the cracking effort and suddenly it got lower when you screwed down the faceplate. And you said, oh, it's too low. I need to add spring tension. And so you screw down the spring cap here, you compress the spring, and nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? Because the poppet was pinned in place by the lever. It was compressed by the elasticity of the diaphragm, and screwing in the spring didn't do anything. That knife edge was still just barely engaged in the seat. It was still very skittish. Sometimes it would free flow, sometimes it wouldn't. But screwing in the cap to the max didn't change cracking effort one bit. And it wasn't until you allowed a little bit of lever drop and didn't correct it that you were able to use the spring effort to increase cracking effort, because while it drove the seat into the knife edge, it didn't kick the lever up so high that it was fighting the diaphragm. So very easy, but it comes with a limit. Now, what's the practical requirement of that? If we look at this regulator, and I'll disassemble it one more time, pinch it, grab it with my fingernail, take off the cover. Oh my God, that's so much better than the D400. Grab my fingernail behind the ring, disassemble it, pluck out the screw and pull off the diaphragm, and be very careful you don't yank it off, because remember, it's engaging the lever right there. So you got to slip that off to the left off of that loop. The starting position for this lever when it's properly tuned is with no slack. That's your set screw position. And interestingly enough, if you look at it, it's just about flush. So I'm sure that's what the manual will tell us. Screw it so that the last thread is flush with the end of the housing. I don't know, but we'll see what the manual says. But the point is, there's no slop in this lever. Now, when I pressurize this, and I could do this right now, pressurize this with, well, you got to be a little careful about taking the top off because the mechanism can pop out of it. It's being held in place by this cap, but you can also hold it in with your finger. With the diaphragm off, that doesn't matter for the valve. It shouldn't leak. But you'll see that when you pressurize it, just like in that movie, the lever will drop 2 millimeters. And now you'll have enough a little slap. You'll have a little slack there that you can then work against it with your spring tension here. So your tuning position, I'm going to guess with the manual, will be just barely trapped in place, or maybe a millimeter of slop in this, no more than that, or no less than that. Because once you pin it in tight, any further tightening now lifts the poppet off the knife edge, and that's where the instability begins. So you're going to depend upon the fact that the lever will drop when you pressurize it, and I would always reassemble this reg and pressurize it before I put the diaphragm on to confirm that that lever drop occurred. so that you have some working distance. Not so much that you lose maximum valve excursion and endanger yourself with thick air, but a couple millimeters at the top isn't going to endanger you, as Scubapro finally admitted with the D420. That's all I got for tuning on that regard. All right, guys, it's 12:30 on the East Coast. Luis, you're an old man. I'm surprised you're still awake.
Hey, I'm old too, Rob, but can I ask a quick question? So should
Yes, sir.
My TFX came out of the box at almost 1.7. So should I just,
you gotta love quality control.
it's
Oh
beautiful.
Lordy.
And,
Well,
obviously,
then just
the
take
band
your
yeah.
pin spanner and take the top off. And while you're waiting on James, take a stubby screwdriver.
Move your camera,
And
please.
if you came at 1.7, say again. Oh, I'm
Your
sorry.
camera's not showing what
I'm not. It's not showing what I'm doing. Okay, I just used my pin spanner to remove the cap because I didn't have James's tool, and I used a screwdriver because I didn't have James's adjuster, and I just took off. I'm sorry. Yes, I took off a half a turn and check it again. Take off another half a turn and check it again. It's as hard as that. And if you do too much, it'll free flow. And if it free flows, then you can turn it back in. What's nice about the center balance valve, you can't cut the knife edge by doing this. All this is doing is increasing or decreasing spring tension. It's not rotating the poppet at all. This reg is fail safe. I mean, if you want, you can depress the lever and pull the poppet away if you want to yield to old habits. But unless there's something in here catching the poppet half, you're not going to twist that on that knife edge, and you can adjust it all day long. So, Rob, I would just say take off a half a turn, recheck it, take off another half turn, recheck it, take your pin spanner and put it back on. Now, be careful if you try and test it with this off. If you don't have your finger on here, this has got 135 psi in here, and this may want to pop off. So
I've learned that
can come back to grab you.
I'm sorry, I've learned that. I've learned that lesson
Okay.
on 400s. But so you answered both questions. First of all, my at James 79 tools are supposed to arrive tomorrow. So I've been patiently waiting because I've got all of it. I just didn't want to mess with it. Second is I don't need to take the pressure off the seat, right? You're saying I can just go ahead and make the turns and get it where I want it.
You might, just in case there's a catch in your spring, and rotating that cap grabs the spring and twists on the top of the poppet, and that whatever. The forces are so light when it's pressurized that it's insignificant. When it's unpressurized, it's maybe 1.5 pounds. So I wouldn't sweat it too much, because if you screw it up, you just take the seat off and flip it over and chalk that one up to experience. But I certainly wouldn't worry about it. But if you want to use the old habit to press the lever while you're working on it, that's the absolute safe thing to do. And that's probably what the manual will say. In practical terms, does it matter? I don't think so.
So go ahead. I'm sorry, you go, sir. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say you've answered, I think, what was it, Stuart was having the problem that you just solved for a minute ago with somehow his.
Well, I sent him a DM, and I don't know if that's true, but he sent me a picture that showed his poppet position, because I was a little concerned about the proper way of. Okay, and unfortunately, without a manual, I was afraid to wing it tonight without a little guidance. And it seemed to me that his poppet was a little higher than mine, and the only way it could be higher, is if that set screw is a little too tight. So I think that may be accounting for some of his instability. He's going to give it a try and see. Be nice to have guessed it at a distance like that, but if so, I was just lucky. Who knows what the real cause is? I've just put it back together. And when you reassemble this, you've got to be good about catching that hook on the top in this receptacle. So you got to center it properly right in the middle and just sort of push at it with your finger and then just swing this over the top and click, you're done. So it's pretty indestructible. Now, is James still here? James might be the one naysayer to say that this plastic is too soft, or this won't stand up to 24 reassemblies. But I think over 30 years this is going to do just fine. And if not, I'll buy an extra faceplate to cover me until I die. I think we're good to go in terms of durability, and I'm not worried about that silicone at all. I mean, unless you're playing with it on the dive boat, I don't think you're going to do any damage at all. I think this is pretty robust, even if it is flexible. But it's not a G260. I mean, it's not something you can beat up. It's mildly more delicate than that, but that just makes it space age. That just makes it lighter. I mean, this has got to be 50 grams lighter, and so I think it's fantastic. I think when it becomes available for $600 instead of $2,500 as a standalone second stage, then we can fight out between a $500 G260 and a $600 TFX, and I'll take the TFX any day of the week. When I come back from Cozumel, we'll see if it stood up to current and dangling off of my octopus in current and light tuning it, and Luis can tell me if I'm a liar. So we'll see.
I got a question. Do you have, when you adjust the spring, I felt on the D400 that because of rotation, every time you adjust it, you kind of always needed to, didn't seem like you're bothering at all with this here. I mean, those springs are so light that as you're rotating, you're actually
you're absolutely
winding
right.
or unwinding
You're absolutely
the spring. Do you have to be
Mm-hmm.
concerned about that
That's
with
right.
this one?
That's exactly right. You do have to be concerned about it. This isn't a D400 spring, but it illustrates what Luis is referring to. The direction of the spring coils is significant with regard to this problem. If this spring is wound, well, I guess I better take it apart just so I can answer the question. If the spring is wound clockwise, when you screw in a cap on top of this, it kind of slips with the turns. If this spring were wound counterclockwise, and unfortunately turning it over doesn't change that, if this were wound counterclockwise, then screwing in would make it want to cock, make it want to twist, and sometimes it gets a little longer. And you'll see that in first stages. If you have a first stage with a counterclockwise round spring, as you start to adjust intermediate pressure, it'll suddenly jump on the gauge until you turn off the pressure, let the spring settle, and start again. Let me grab the James's tool. This is just too hard without it. So
well,
much
I always
faster
found
this
that
way.
just going a little bit further and just backing it up a little bit.
Exactly. Well, that all depends on whether or not the spring is counterclockwise wound or counterclockwise. So if we're increasing cracking effort, we're going to be cracking this in clockwise. And so let's look at this spring and see how it's wound. This, in fact, is a clockwise wound spring. And that's why I didn't see much in the way of stuttering as I tried to increase pressure. However, as I run my finger over it, no, I don't feel any catches. This is good. This should slip well, but I may turn to doing the same thing that I did with the D400. On the D400, I insert a little graphite washer right in there, a graphite impregnated plastic washer, which decreases the friction significantly. It also means the cap is about 1 millimeter higher, so you have to be a little concerned about that. But it eliminates that problem of catching as you rotate the cap. And I think with this one, clockwise winding shouldn't be an issue. Counterclockwise winding risks cocking the spring because it's going against and it's potentially catching that tip right there. And as it unwinds it, the spring wants to get longer. So you may see a little problem unwinding it. If you try and lower cracking effort, you may have to go past where you want and then go back clockwise a little bit.
Thanks.
All right, you guys are the last men standing. I've been told by my wife that I'm due for dinner, So I will call this an evening, and I appreciate you joining me. This has been fun stuff.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's great.
Thanks, Rob.
You're welcome.
Really
Yeah, thanks
appreciate
very
it.
much, Rob.
Adios,
It's been
guys.
great.
Take care.
Thank you.